Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So this is going to be, as you can see, a long one, and it's going to be a big breakdown on the Beall podcast with Dan from Debunking and Neil from Gnostic Informant on Baalbek. I'm going to cover Baalbek in this one, the Sphinx, pyramids, Giza, the stone cutting techniques and abilities of the Egyptologists, and what the mainstream narrative is. And then I'm going to look at the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and the whole narrative around that story and what Neil says about it. So what we're going to do is break down what the claims are that are being made in this podcast, and we're going to use sources and evidence. Okay, everything that Gnostic says, he wants to use sources and evidence. This is Baalbek to start.
You could see the same exact style, that style right there, Herod's temple, built in the same century.
Yeah.
Same style.
And
it just doesn't have that same size stone.
Okay, but
that one stone.
That's not, man.
That's the same style of building.
Yeah,
What do you mean? Look at the bottom, the huge stones.
So the stones, the largest stones are in Herod's temple at the lowest level. Okay, the most massive construction blocks were placed near the base to support the immense weight of the temple mount retaining walls. That makes total sense. Put the largest stones on the bottom, so you don't have to lift them, because there's so much more mechanical shit you got to get into with lifting gigantic stones that are multi 10, 20, 250, 300 tons here. Some estimates go up to 500 and 600 tons. And then we're going to look at the size of the stones that we're talking about in Baalbek. So right here, this is from Graham Hancock's book, Magicians of the Gods. And now this is a photo of him when he was at Baalbek. And it says the author's right foot is placed in front of the fragment of a Roman column. So Roman column, because they were repairing it down the bottom. And now it says beneath the trilithon. Okay, that's what we're talking about. That giant stone up here. So let's see what Gnostic has to say about these giant stones and the Romans' ability to use them and build with them. In the 1st century BC, he's going to quote.
And we know they can lift that stuff. Have you read Vitruvius? You never read Vitruvius? Who wrote in the 1st century BCE in book 10, writes exactly how they would, he talks about gigantic stones of heavy weight. It's a whole chapter on
and in real history, we've tried it,
technology
and we couldn't do
described about how it's done. Like, what's the evidence?
That was a little clip of Gnostic later on in the podcast saying, what's the evidence for something else? But I'm using it throughout this whole video because you're asking, what's the evidence? I'm going to ask you the same thing. What's the evidence? Okay, this is Vitruvius book 10. In the pneumatic class, I just thought this was really interesting. In the pneumatic class, air is forced by pressure to produce sounds and tones as in an organon. Now that's in Greek, ancient Greek. Now number 2, this is what we're talking about. In the hoisting class, heavy weights are removed by machines which raise them up and set them in position. So he does talk about it, but what are we talking about? What the sizes of these stones are that we're talking about? Now this is it right here, book 10, section 5. But if the loads of material for the work are still more colossal in size and weight, we shall not entrust them to a windlass, but set in an axle tree, held by sockets as the windlass was, and carrying on its center a large drum, which some term a wheel. Now he's talking about an axle tree, and how much can an axle tree actually hold? Because ancient Roman axle trees, according to the AI we pull up these days, when they pull up AI in the video, so I'm going to use AI. The ancient Roman axle trees, which were the central shafts of their cranes, hoists, and windlasses, could typically lift between 3 and 6 tons when operated by humans, and up to 50 to 100 tons when combined with massive wooden lifting towers. Now, look at the bottom. For extreme weights such as the massive 70-ton marble drums on Trajan's column or the 100-ton blocks in the temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, that's what we're talking about, 100 tons. So you would need one ancient Roman axle tree to carry 100 tons of whatever you're talking about. In this case, blocks of stone. 100 tons per axle tree at the maximum. Now, how much does the trilithon stone weigh? The trilithon at Baalbek in Lebanon consists of 3 massive limestone blocks. Each individual stone weighs approximately 800 tons. So to scale that, you would need 8 ancient Roman axle trees to lift just one trilithon stone. And he says, Gnostic says they can do it. He talks about them doing it, but we're going to see later there are still other more gigantic trilithon stones sitting in the ground because they were too big for the Romans to lift. But apparently they could do it. Now the quarrying bit is fine. It's not that far to move, but the weight of it is gigantic. So they were quarried about 900 meters away, and they were elevated approximately 7 meters, 23 feet off the ground. The ancient Roman axle tree cannot lift 800 tons unless you had, scale it, 8 of them. Now, what Vitruvius does talk about with heavy stuff, and he cites the temple of Diana at Ephesus. And then we look here, this is the ruins of that site. nothing like the trilithon stones at Baalbek.
Never read Vitruvius? Where's the evidence of the temple that was there before? Do you think people would talk about this gigantic megalithic temple that's there? There's nothing. It never gets talked about. It's only after this is built.
So he's saying, why aren't there any ancient sources on this being built or this existing before the Romans? But now Dan's going to ask, okay, why don't the Romans themselves talk about building it? Because you would think the meticulous Roman records that they keep, and if they were able to lift a gigantic stone this big, they would have documented it to show how good they were, how technologically superior they were. They would have documented that.
Why didn't the Romans record when they built it?
They did.
Why didn't the Romans record when they built it? He said they did. They did. All right? What records and evidence do we have of that? There are no known surviving Roman writings that document the construction methods, dates, architects, or engineers of the colossal temple complex at Baalbek, Heliopolis, what it was called in Greek earlier. While Romans meticulously recorded much of their engineering and monumental construction elsewhere, their primary texts on Baalbek focus entirely on its religious or oracular significance. Primary sources on Baalbek are scattered across Greco-Roman, early Christian, and medieval Islamic texts, because Roman accounts of the construction are notoriously missing. I'm not even going to go through the 5th century CE and the 6th century CE sources, because that's 500 and 600 years after. The only one you could pull is Josephus, maybe, because it's 1st century CE. It's around the same time. But it doesn't talk about the temple construction itself, as it says down here. It's talking about modern scholars using his work to study the similar megalithic architecture commissioned by Herod, which is what Gnostic's talking about, the Temple of Herod.
Why didn't the Romans record when they built it?
They did.
Playing it again, because he said they did. They recorded it when they built it.
Romans never once talk about building
Lucian.
So he quotes Lucian. We've looked at Lucian before in detail, and we're going to look at it again, what he actually says about the building of Baalbek. But he said they did, and he quotes Lucian. But see what he says about it.
Once talk about building
Lucian. After this is built, it's talked about by contemporary writers.
Okay.
Lucian of Samosata lived in 150 AD. He talks about this whole temple complex.
After. He said after it was built. So before he was asked, where's the evidence of the Romans talking about building it? He said they did. And then he says, no, it's after they built it.
What's the evidence?
What's the evidence, you ask? Thank you, Gnostic. The 2nd century satirist Lucian of Samosata, who we've looked at many times before, briefly mentions the great temple complex at Baalbek, historically known as Heliopolis, which he calls it, in his treatise on the Syrian goddess. You see down the bottom, it is not an eyewitness account. So he likes to talk about primary sources and all this. What did Lucian say? So the first quote we've had was Vitruvius saying nothing about lifting it and being able to lift 800 tons. The second source, Lucian, is in Greek, and I'm going to read it to you right now. This is it right here, in ancient Greek. Now, down below is actually a pretty decent translation in English, but you can see right here, Phoenikes, so that's talking about the Phoenicians. Hieron comes from hieron, or hieros, and it's talking about being a divine place. So they say it's a temple. Not Assyrian, Aegyptian, Egyptian, Heliopolios, right here. That's Heliopolis. Into Phoenicia. I have not seen it, laid eyes on it, seen it myself, but it is both mega, great, large, and archaion, ancient. So that's pretty close. The Phoenicians have another temple, not Assyrian, but Egyptian. Came to Phoenicia from Heliopolis. I have not seen it, but it too, it says it is both large and ancient. So the sources he's quoting do not say they can lift 800-ton stones with their ancient Roman axle trees. And the other source, Lucian, in ancient Greek, does not say anything about the construction of the temple or anything about the complex. He just says, I haven't seen it myself, but it is large and ancient. So on 2 accounts now, Gnostic is just wrong on the sources he's quoting. And now you're going to see him move the goalpost and say, no, it's not about building it. It's about after, when they built it.
Romans never talk about setting those major stones at Trilithon. They talk about building. They talk about building. They talk about building. Why didn't the Romans record when they built it? The Romans never once talk about building.
There's not a record of everything being built.
The Romans who kept meticulous records of what they built. Why didn't the Romans record when they built it?
They did.
Herod's wall was not built identical to that. This is two different stages of construction.
It's very, very, very similar.
You could even say they tried to emulate
smaller.
Okay, so he said it is similar. Okay, they have large stones on the bottom, smaller stones on the top. But he said it gets progressively smaller. It kind of does and it kind of doesn't, because those trilithon stones in the middle, they've got beautiful Roman stones. I'm not saying they're not good. Look at the stones next to it. They've got like inlet cut stones right next to the giant stones. If it gets progressively smaller, then why do you have small stones next to a gigantic stone here That's not progressive. That's inlaying smaller stones into the big stone because they didn't have anything there, and there was no way that the Romans could put a trilithon stone next to it, because if they could, like he said they were able to, because Vitruvius says they could, then they would have put another one right there in the corner. Why didn't they? There's 3 more stones sitting in the quarry 900 meters away. If the Romans were able to do it and they did this, then why didn't they put the other trilithon stone here in the corner, right next to the other one, so it looks the same? This is a better picture. Look at this. Now, you see it, there's a giant stone on the bottom here, then it's got smaller stones, still big, but they're smaller above them, and then you've got the beveled edges, and then you've got giant trilithons. So, okay, these gigantic stones here, up here and here, they're all gigantic. And then you see right here on the corner, a set of Roman stones, and it's completely different. Look at the stones at the top. They are completely different to the bottom and the middle. So if the Romans did it all, why are they using different materials at the same time period? Doesn't make sense.
This argument in the past from the alternative community is that the erosion on the big stones is completely different than the erosion on the regular stones.
You can see it.
You can see the erosion features too. Look, these gigantic stones, they have completely different erosion patterns to these Roman ones up the top. Look, you can see it's all bent around here, weathered, eroded, and these ones still look in pretty damn good shape, to be honest. These ones are still fitting together perfectly, and these ones at the bottom are too. It's not the same construction. It is just not the same. It's not all Roman. There's no way. You can see it clear as day for yourself right here.
I mean, it's a gigantic. It does have a different. It just stands out. I mean,
I'll ask you, why do the stones underneath the trilithon lack the beveled edges as the ones above? That right there just shows this to me that there's 2 different crews involved.
It almost looks like they were trying to make the bevels go higher up, and maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. This is something I do need to look into more. I wish I was more prepared on this one.
Yeah, you need to look into it a bit more. Look at this. Look, I'm not saying the Romans aren't doing beautiful construction. Look at these stones. Clearly see the Roman stones have this cut out on the edge of around all these blocks, these smaller blocks, which is amazing to look at, but it's not the same as the trilithon stones right next to it. It's completely different. If you can't see this, you don't want to see it.
I'll say this, to agree with you, that it's very mysterious.
It's very mysterious. But you said just a couple of seconds ago, we know how they did it. It's been documented. They told us how they built it. Oh, wait, they didn't tell us how they built it. They talked about it after how they built it. But you were so adamant that no, mainstream's right. Vitruvius talked about it. You never read Vitruvius? Oh, well, have you fucking read Vitruvius? Because I just pulled it up for you, and he doesn't say a damn thing about them lifting stones of 800 tons and more, as we're going to see. And then you quoted Lucian to say, oh, Lucian talks about the whole complex. No, he doesn't. He said it was huge and ancient. That's it. And now you're saying, oh, it's mysterious. See? Backpedaling. Now we're going to look at a bit of Graham Hancock talking about the site, because he's been there. And he's talking about what's there, what it looks like to him, what is actually still there in this dirt. And if the Romans were able to move this, why couldn't they move the stones that were right there sitting next to them in the quarry?
A Roman site for sure, but what about this bizarre enclosure wall that surrounds it, which is totally separate from the Temple of Jupiter? What's this about? This is called the trilithon. Each of these 3 blocks weighs 900 tons. And it's extraordinary the way they're built into a wall and raised 30 feet above the ground like this, a wall the provenance for which has not been established by archaeology. Nearby is the quarry, and the quarry contains a number of very large blocks that were never transported from the quarry site. The one I'm standing on weighs 1,000 tons.
So for scale, if it was 1,000 tons and the Romans were able to do it, you would need 10 ancient Roman axle trees, because it says they could lift 100 tons with 1 axle tree. So to scale that, you would need 10 ancient Roman axle trees to lift this stone right here. Gnostic said they were able to do it.
And we know they can lift that stuff.
So why is it still sitting there?
That one over there weighs 1,200 tons.
You would need 12 ancient Roman axle trees for this one.
That I'm standing on here, which is only recently excavated, turns out to weigh 1,400 tons.
So you would need 14 ancient Roman axle trees.
What archaeologists say, and it still amuses me, of course the Romans did everything, they found they could move 900-ton blocks, but 1,000 tons was too much for them. So they couldn't move them. So they just left them in the quarry. In my view, that's a very un-Roman thing to do. The Romans were very practical people. Okay, let's say they couldn't move 1,000 tons, but having gone to all the work of creating huge megaliths like this, they wouldn't have wasted them. They'd have sliced them up like loaves of bread and used the already shaped blocks in other constructions.
Now, I had the same idea. I'm going to show you that Sacsayhuaman in Peru has the same kind of, not the exact same construction, but it's megalithic construction coupled with smaller later construction to fit into other areas, but with smaller blocks, just like we see in Baalbek. So here it is right here. You see these giant stones in the middle and all down here and up the top here. And look at the difference in these rocks. I'm going to call them rocks that they put to fill in these gaps around these giant megalithic stones. That's the same thing we saw at Baalbek with the Romans putting their blocks right next to giant trilithon stones. So it's not just in one place in the world, it's all over the world. Here's a great example right here. Look, it's a bunch of stacked up little stones next to the gigantic wall. You're telling me that they, look at the building in this too. It's rounded edges. This isn't straight cut carved stone. This is rounded edges. There's no way to explain that with Inca technology if these are the rocks that they're putting in there. See what I mean? Smaller blocks in Baalbek next to giant stones. The trilithon. Same kind of construction. Building on top of what is already there. Now we're going to move on to the Sphinx.
The key piece of evidence is the erosion on the walls, right?
That's the Robert Schoch version.
Can we pull that up? I mean, that's got to be at the top of your list in terms of...
That's a big reason, yeah. It's a huge reason.
I don't understand how you explain this with wind.
So right there, you can see the vertical fissures coming down, and then you see the layer cake right here in the softer part of the limestone. And then it rolls into the lower part, so it's curved. And this is what happens when water trickles down a rock. It makes vertical fissures. And it makes rounded edges, 100%. And this is not just me saying that. We're going to look at geologists saying that.
With wind. That's the only thing I struggle with, because it's like, it's vertical.
That's what other geologists say, right?
Robert Schoch and his theory about the temple and the erosion outside of the Sphinx, that it's water erosion.
When Schoch said that, we brought through the American Research Center a scientist from Louisville University. And he came and we published many articles that the erosion that you see outside and inside the Sphinx is from wind.
All right, Zahi said they brought in an American Indian geologist scientist to look at that after Robert Schoch came out with his information, his evidence of the Sphinx erosion in the 90s, okay? 1990 he went there. So let's look at this Indian American scientist geologist. Dr. K.L. Gowrie, Indian American geologist and professor emeritus at the University of Louisville, widely recognized as a pioneering expert in stone conservation and the geological weathering of ancient monuments. Okay, now, weathering mechanisms down here. Through his research, he disproved fringe theories suggesting the Sphinx was eroded primarily by ancient heavy rainfall or floods. Instead, he proved the erosion was predominantly caused by salt crystallization, accelerated by rapid fluctuations in desert temperature and humidity. Okay, so that's what this is saying on the AI. And it's saying he disproved fringe theories. Now, fringe theory would be, I understand if you're going to say that from a fringe, so someone who's not in the field has no idea what they're talking about. But Robert Schoch, professor at Boston University, teaching geology, and he has a PhD in geology and geophysics. That is not fringe. This is how the mainstream is framing the narrative to say, it's just disproved fringe theories. No, it's a geologist that's saying, hey, the evidence you're putting together and presenting to the world is bullshit. I just don't like how it's being framed, so everyone who doesn't know what the hell's going on is just saying, oh, it's all fringe. So people who don't look into this, they just dismiss it. But actually, let's take a look at this guy. Dr. Gowrie and his team measured and analyzed the weathering and erosion of the Great Sphinx and its enclosure walls primarily during a 5-week intensive field study in November and December 1981. Hang on a minute. I thought you said he went after Schoch made his announcement about the water erosion. They published their foundational geological findings from this research over several years, most notably in their geological study of the Sphinx 1984. So that's even earlier than Schoch still. And then after Schoch's evidence came out, geologic weathering and its implications in the age of the Sphinx, trying to counter Schoch's evidence. in 1995 because Robert Schoch, geologist Dr. Robert Schoch, mind you, first visited Egypt to study the Sphinx enclosure in June 1990. Then he formally presented his water erosion hypothesis in 91, and then he published it in 92. So Schoch wasn't even on the scene with this stuff until 1991, 1992. This guy did this in the 80s and then was forced to publish this one in 1995 to counter Schoch's evidence, Dr. Schoch's evidence. Now, let's take a look at the abstract of the 1995 study, April 1995. Dr. K. Lau Gowrie, Geologic Weathering and its Implications on the Age of the Sphinx, 1995. Now it says Schoch and West have suggested the Sphinx is much older, based primarily upon the rounded profile of the strata of the Sphinx thorax and the deep channels present in the wall surrounding the Sphinx ditch, or the enclosure. Now it says it's due to precipitation-induced weathering formed when the Sahara still experienced a humid climate at least 7,000 years ago. That's actually not what he, it is kind of what he says, but it's not, because this was in 1995, so we'll show you exactly what he says in the Joe Rogan podcast. Now it says we show further that the channels are actually pre-Pliocene karst features formed by underground water. Hang on a minute. Zahi Hawass has been telling us it's wind, but the guy he's citing in 1995 said it's underground water. And that's what Gnostic says. He said he stood there and he saw water coming up from under the ground. We've got a couple of problems. One problem is Zahi's lying, or he's misrepresenting the data, because his own person that he cited is not saying it's wind erosion in 1995. He's saying it's underground water and exposed due to the excavation of the Sphinx ditch. Well, we've got another massive problem now, because if he's saying the underground water in the limestone already looked like that when they carved it out due to the excavation of the Sphinx, so it already looked like this when they carved it out, we've got a big problem, because this is an image of the Sphinx temple which they carved out the limestone blocks to use as a temple, as we'll see Robert Schoch talk about. They used the limestone blocks they carved out from the Sphinx enclosure as a temple. Look at the limestone. It doesn't look anything like what we just saw in the Sphinx enclosure with the rolling rounded edges and the vertical fissures. These are cut blocks of limestone. And now we're going to look at what is pre-Pliocene karst features. Refers to geological time periods prior to the Pliocene epoch, which began about 5.3 million years ago and ended 2.6 million years ago. So he's saying this happened millions and millions of years ago. So the rock already looked like that when they carved it out. But as we just saw, the stones in that temple do not look like this. They look like cut blocks of stone. And if he's saying that this looked like this millions of years ago from underground water, then all the blocks of stone would be rounded edges, and they are not. And they would have vertical fissures in them, and they do not. And then they're saying karst is a distinctive, often rugged landscape formed by the dissolution of soluble bedrock in limestone. That's what we're talking about. Characterized by internal drainage and unique erosion patterns. Now down the bottom, grooves, ridges, and small fissures etched into bare rock surfaces by flowing acidic water. What has Zahi Hawass been telling everyone?
The erosion that you see outside and inside the Sphinx is from wind.
I'm pretty sure he's lying to you right now, or misrepresenting the data, so you see it's wind, even though the dude I'm citing and I brought over to have a look and study this is saying it's from water.
Well, there's water underneath it. Mm-hmm. So my understanding is, and I'm totally not an expert, so I'm just giving you my thoughts on this, is that the water underneath it sort of comes up.
Yeah, water wicking, as they call it.
Precipitates from underneath it. And that's where you get water and wind erosion.
Now here's Robert Schoch on Joe Rogan explaining why that cannot be the case.
The vertical fissures that can only be caused by precipitation. The water also finds its way down crevices and cracks, natural features that are slightly softer, and it forms these vertical fissures. I want to make the point because a lot of people get confused. They say, couldn't it be rising Nile floods? No. Geologically, that would give a very different signature on the rock. It's not floods coming up from the bottom. It's actually precipitation and rainfall runoff coming from above.
So he said geologically it would give a different signature. So it cannot be water coming from the bottom up. It has to be precipitation top down. That's the geologist saying this. Scientist, mainstream academic. okay? Not fringe.
I think the responsible thing to do if you're not an expert is to appeal to people who are experts.
Exactly. Good thing. So you're looking at an expert that just told you it is not from groundwater up. It is from precipitation down. And I'm going to show you how mainstream he was. His ideas were about the Sphinx before he even looked at it.
Remember, I'm a faculty member. I'm at Boston University. I'm an academic. And many of the academics have poo-pooed, should we say, over the years, bringing things to the public, but I think it's been important to do.
What do you mean it comes up underneath it?
Because when I was there was actually a big puddle of water right next to it. Okay. And there's water underneath it that comes up sometimes.
So it's like almost like a tidal. It just goes up and down,
I guess
up and
it
down,
just comes up from the ground.
I guess this is what happens. I'm just going to sit here and say whatever I want because I have no idea what I'm talking about and I haven't done the research.
For however process.
They call it wicking.
That's what I forgot the name of it. Yeah.
So
it could be that.
It could be that. It could be. No, it can't.
They say, couldn't it be rising Nile floods? No. Geologically, that would give a very different signature on the rock. It's not floods coming up from the bottom. It's actually precipitation and rainfall runoff coming from above.
There you go. It can't be what you're saying it is. You're sitting there projecting the mainstream narrative on a debate, but you haven't done any of the research. You haven't listened to the experts in the field.
Sitting in like groundwater, basically?
There's water underneath it, yeah.
There is a lot of water.
But water underneath it isn't going to cause those things. The water has to be flowing down.
And that's why even when I was there, I saw a giant puddle right next to the Sphinx. It was wet.
When Robert Schoch sent these images around to his colleagues and didn't tell them what it was, every one of them, this is water erosion. It's the minute that the context shows up, the science gets called into question.
Exactly right. D. Duncan brings that up perfectly. I didn't put it in the clips, but you can find it. Robert Schoch talks about, he takes images that he took of these erosion features on the Sphinx, but he takes a really close-up image, and he sent it to a bunch of geologists and asked them, hey, what do you think this is from? What kind of weathering is this? And they all said, oh yeah, that's rainfall, heavy rainfall, like thousands of years of precipitation. And then when he told them it was the Sphinx, they were all like, we don't really want to get into that Egyptology debate. Like, we want to stay out of this. Well, they all backpedaled. But when they didn't have the context and they just saw the images, they all said it was precipitation-induced weathering from rainfall. Geologists, okay? Experts in the field, not Egyptologists who, as we will see, and we're seeing right now, they're trying to obfuscate the data to keep promoting the narrative that they want.
I'll call it pseudoscience all fucking day long. If this is scientific and this is how it is, and then the second that it doesn't coincide with my predetermined opinion, at that point I have a hard time not putting everybody that does that shit in the same camp as a creationist.
I think another option is that that bottom section was naturally formed similar to that, and they only carved out the top of it. Like, you understand what I'm saying? Like, you had a mound there and you have to carve out the Sphinx. So like most of that was already exposed. Like, what's the evidence?
Also, I want to point out that when you look at the Sphinx, and other geologists have looked at this as well, they did not just chip away at the rock to carve the body. More or less, you could have chipped away at the rock with pickaxes and that type of thing, shoveled out chips of rock in baskets. That would have been the easy way. What they did is they carved out huge blocks of stone. And when I say huge, we're talking multi-ton, tens of tons, some of them maybe over 50 tons or more of limestone. They moved those due east of the Sphinx and built what is now known as the Sphinx Temple, which is still there in ruinous condition, and the Valley Temple. So you had these two huge temples.
Okay, so you heard it right there from the geologist himself who studied this back in the 90s and all throughout the 2000s. And we see here the Sphinx Temple right in front of it. And you look at those blocks as we saw before, but this is one of Schoch's own photos. Look at it. These are cut blocks. You don't see the erosion features like this rounded edges back here in the enclosure on these same blocks. So it can't be from millions of years ago. Here's an even better photo, like a close-up photo. You can see, yeah, it's got some weathering from what would be some rainfall and some erosion, some rounding, but it's not the rounded edges that we see over here in the enclosure.
An astronomical design on the ground, which memorializes a very ancient date, does not have to have been done 12,500 years ago. From the ancient Egyptian point of view, you're there 4,500 years ago. There's a time 8,000 years before that which is very, very, very important to you, you could use astronomical language and megalithic architecture to memorialize that date on the Giza Plateau, except for one thing, and that's the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. And we're pretty sure that the Sphinx, at least, does date back to 12,500 years ago. And with it, the megalithic temples, but the Valley Temple, attributed to Khafre on no good grounds whatsoever,
We'll take a look at that later.
is a huge megalithic construction with blocks of limestone that weigh up to 100 tons each. And yet it has been remodeled, refaced with granite placed on top of the core limestone blocks. Core limestone blocks were already eroded when the granite blocks were put there. Why? Because the granite blocks have actually been purposefully and deliberately cut to fit into the erosion marks on the, we believe, much older megalithic blocks there.
That empty space used to be filled with limestone. So that all had limestone attached to it. So why would you cut out limestone and make it look like water erosion?
I'm not saying they made it look like that. I'm saying that's just how it formed. That's how it looks now.
But it didn't form that way. They cut it that way. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think they cut. I think it's mostly, yeah, it's cut. Like, I'm just saying, like, that's just what the material is already. Even cutting it, it's just, that's the material.
So it would just like fall off, you mean? Like you would have like loose, like you cut it and you don't get those lines, do you? I mean, you're just removing stone off of that. I don't know. That's a good question. I
don't know. I'm not. I can't even get to this. Like, I don't know.
You don't know. Where have I heard that before? Yeah, we'll take a look at that later.
I do know this, though. I do know that the primary sources, like the inscriptions, the later dynasties, are all pointing to the... Is it Khafre, the son of Khufu, that they think it is? Yeah.
The Kaf part is already flagged off from the dream stele. It was already just Kaf. Yeah. And they inserted, or they thought, it should be Khafre. So that's why Khafre built it.
That's the evidence we have that it's Khafre. Okay? Inferring that it's him based on this tiny bit here and this tiny bit here. We don't know that that's what that is. That's an assumption.
There were periods when the Sphinx was completely covered in sand, but still the head stuck out. By the time you come to the fourth dynasty, when the Great Pyramids are supposedly built, the original lion head would have been a complete mess. And we suggest that it was then recarved into a pharaonic head. Egyptologists think it was the pharaoh Khafre, but there's no real strong resemblance. But it's definitely wearing the Nemes headdress of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh.
So on the left is Khafre, and on the right is the Sphinx head. You're telling me that's the same person that they've carved in the Sphinx that is on the left? No way. That face, I even did a project on this back in like early high school, year 7, when I was a teenager, talking about the sub-Saharan African face. This is not Khafre on the Sphinx head. No way. There's not Khafre. You can see that clearly for yourself.
That's what they say. And that's, so I'm just kind of going off, like, what's the evidence? The material evidence.
That's the material evidence we have.
They're all claiming this. I would like to see really good reason to think otherwise.
Well, if you can't see that right there, there's a really good reason to think otherwise, then you are willingly blinding yourself to reality and what's sitting right in front of you. Or you haven't looked at this evidence.
Robert Schoch said it's not his theory. It's a theory of a New Age guy who talked about this before, and John Antonowitz brought...
Schwala.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Who. Then we gave this guy from Louisville University, who was an Indian American, who really studied. He came to the Sphinx.
I really can't stand the way he talks. It's so pompous, arrogant. This guy is so bad. And we're going to see more of him later. But this is Zahir Was, like the top fucking Egyptologist in the world for all this stuff. And he has been for decades. And the way he talks is just the most arrogant you can ever get. It's dismissive and arrogant. And now you understand why it takes so goddamn long for anything to progress in this world when you've got people like this that are the heads of departments that are maintaining and controlling our history. It's human history, right? It's not just Egyptian history, it's human history. And you've got people like this sitting there, ivory towering it, acting like this. Now you know why we're in the position we're in. Not just in Egyptology, archaeology, classics, which I've already shown. Now you know why we're in the position we're in. When you got people like this standing at the gates of history.
There can be people who call themselves doctors and they think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. That can happen. And I've seen it with biblical studies. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
I literally just showed you that's what's happening with this guy's Ayahuasca.
The erosion that you see outside and inside the Sphinx is from wind.
But as I showed you, the guy who he's citing, who he brought in, he's saying it is water. So someone's lying, and it looks like a Zahi.
No, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology.
Well, I do, and I think I've just proved it. But we're going to prove it even more.
This is late 1980s. I was and still do teach at Boston University full-time. Robert Eddy mentioned me as a geologist to John Anthony West, and that maybe this was someone who seems fairly knowledgeable, fairly open-minded.
Did you have any thoughts about the dating of the Sphinx or the pyramids or anything back then before you looked into it?
Yeah, there were two things. Number one, I knew the conventional story. I knew that the Sphinx goes back to 2500 BC, according to the standard Egyptologist. I had in my mind that the Egyptologists must be correct because they've studied it, they must know what they're doing. I was coming from an academic point of view, gone to Yale University to get my PhD in geology and geophysics. I was very well grounded in, quote, the status quo academic point of view.
There you go. Very well grounded in the status quo academic point of view. He is as mainstream as it gets before he went to the Sphinx and looked at the evidence for himself. Expert.
I think the responsible thing to do if you're not an expert is to appeal to people who are experts.
So I thought when I first went to Egypt, I would just prove West wrong. I would just prove that the Egyptologists knew what they were talking about.
So he said he was coming at it from a mainstream point of view. And Zahir was saying, oh, it's a new age guy who had a theory, fringe theory. And they're saying it here, fringe theories. He was the most mainstream as you could get. He thought the Egyptologists were like, nope, they've got it right. They must have it right because he knew the standard model of history according to Egyptology and according to the mainstream. That's where he was coming from. Mainstream, not outside. He's a geologist. He's a doctor in geology and geophysics. What more expert research do you need?
I was also trained in many ways, both as a graduate student and going back to my grandmother, who I had great respect for, and was also very, should we say, liberal and open-minded, but critical. You always have to follow the evidence. You always have to follow the evidence wherever it goes, and that's always been my rule of thumb, that not everything is always the way people say it is.
Perfect quote. Not everything is always the way people say it is. Just because there's Zahi Hawass or Mark Lehner or some classicist that doesn't know Greek, which I've shown before. It's like, come on, just because they're a PhD doesn't mean they know everything. And it takes another PhD, which we've seen in other fields, to bring evidence that those, quote, mainstream, dogmatic, narrative-driven people cannot get their heads around, or they don't want to. Remember, this happened a long time ago with Percy Fawcett in South America. They're like, there's no way that there could be the amount of people living in South America and the amount of infrastructure in South America and temples in South America. And now look, LiDAR scanning is showing that, holy shit, he was right. We've seen it on multiple fronts in these archaeological fields, classical fields, geological fields, and we're seeing this narrative being pushed back with evidence and overthrown. It will be overthrown with evidence, enough evidence. But you got people sitting here like Gnostic Informant saying, oh, I'm mainstream, I'm just parroting the mainstream narrative. Based on what? No evidence. You're sitting there and you're saying, I don't know. You're citing sources that don't say what you say they say. I've already proven this guy to be a disingenuous liar, and he's doing it again. But let's continue with Shock, who's a doctor in geology and geophysics, all right? Let's see what he has to say.
Even if they're, quote, authorities. And something I already knew when I went to Egypt for the first time was that some of the very old Egyptologists in the late 19th, early 20th century had actually suggested that just the way it looks, the feel of the Sphinx, maybe it was older than the pyramid.
Did you hear that? Even some of the older, original Egyptologists were saying maybe it's older than what it is, but it was way too early to be bringing out any of this stuff in like the 1800s, early 1900s. But the early ones were saying maybe it is older. What that tells me is back then they even had more of an open mind than they do now, because what is it all driven off now? Zahir was selling books. I went to the Ramsay's exhibition here when it came out to Australia. And what were they selling at the end of the tour? Oh, Zahir was books all over the place. These dogmatic narratives are to make money, because if their books are proven wrong, then there goes their whole life, their whole life's work. That's okay for people who are scientific minded and can deal with evidence that counters what they've been brought up with or believe. But see, this shouldn't be about belief. This should be about science and the evidence. And that's what that's showing me, is the people who are in charge of these fields, Egyptology, classics, are not doing science. They're there to make money, to push a narrative. I've already proven that on the classic side. Now I'm proving it on this side. This is our history they're fucking with.
Maybe dogma of the day is just that, the dogma of the day, that there are other possibilities. And not that we accept something just because someone said it. You keep everything open, you look at the evidence, and that's really where I was coming from.
See? Rational, open-minded, look at the evidence, whatever the evidence brings, then let's have a look at it and bring it to the table and see it with an open mind. Not Zahir was saying it's wind while citing someone who's saying it's water. Now the next bit from Shock is talking about what he thought he would see when he got to Egypt the first time to look at the Sphinx.
Honestly, when I first went to Egypt with John Anthony West in 1990, I thought before I got off the plane that this would be simple open and shut case. I would prove him wrong in the sense of his assertions that maybe the Sphinx was older. I had no doubt at the time that my colleagues in Egyptology must know what they're talking about. And all of that changed literally within, without exaggerating, 30 to 120 seconds of first seeing the Sphinx. Yeah, it really did.
What was your first impression?
Because my first impression of the Sphinx was, now that I saw it on the ground in person, there was something wrong with the Egyptological dating. This was not weathered by wind and sand. This was not desert erosion and weathering that I saw on the Sphinx. The Sphinx enclosure is important because it preserves a lot of the details. Precipitation, erosional features that are incompatible with the last 5,000 years of climatic history on the eastern edge of the Sahara.
The limestone erosion in the Sphinx enclosure is not compatible, according to a geologist, with the last 5,000 years of the climate in Egypt. So based on that, it has to be earlier, because there hasn't been any rainfall like the amount that would cause that level of erosion, water erosion, precipitation induced weathering in the last 5,000 years in Egypt. It hasn't happened. So how then, if there hasn't been this much rainfall in the last 5,000 years, and the Sphinx has been covered in sand multiple times over that time period, Thutmose IV dreamed it that he would remove the sand from the Sphinx and make the Sphinx seen again. So if it was even under sand in the dynastic time, then how is it getting all this weathering? If it's been covered in sand, you're not going to get any weathering. It's covered in sand. It's going to be preserved. And there's been no rainfall like this that would cause this amount of weathering in the last 5,000 years. So it has to be at least older than 5,000 years.
And rainfall for thousands of years?
There's two aspects here. It could be thousands of years. It could be much stronger rainfall, huge flash floods, that type of thing. Initially, I was thinking 5,000 to 7,000 BC. That was very conservative based on the geological data. But now I believe we're talking prior to 9,700 BC for the original construction of the Sphinx. At 9,700 BC, we have the end of the Younger Dryas, the end of the glacial epoch, the end of the last ice age, huge climatic changes which put, among other things, a lot of moisture into the air, which came down as precipitation with huge floods.
We will get into the Younger Dryas and all the evidence of the Younger Dryas, but right here, Shock, talking about the Sphinx enclosure, is saying the weathering looks like it is coming from giant rainfall from the end of the Younger Dryas period. The climatic shift, which was cataclysmic, catastrophic in terms of anything we've known on Earth before in our period of time. So we're talking about the end of the Ice Age, 11,600 years ago, 9,600 BC. That's just when it's weathered, okay? That's not talking about when it's built. That's talking about when the weathering erosion happens in the enclosure, which means it's already exposed. So they would have built it earlier than that. And we will have a look at what dating could be according to the alignments of the stars and what was going on at the time when they think it was built.
Huge, essentially thunderstorms, etc. And I think a lot of the initial erosion that we still see on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure go back to that period. So you had the situation where you would get this incredible weathering and erosion, and then it continued for thousands of years after that and was reinforced.
Nothing in modern history
is even close to this, but we do have isotope data, etc., that indicates this has happened in the past at the end of the last ice age.
Okay, so we have data that indicates this has happened at the end of the last ice age. More evidence, not just the geology, but also the isotopes.
Until you had the Sahara coming in relatively recent times.
The Sahara desert, as it is now, hasn't always been a desert.
You see things like this, and then the pushback that we get on the ideas that it's as old as it is, the astronomical stuff, the Orion-Giza correlation, if I'm sure you guys have heard of it, but the 3 belt stars in Orion's belt lining up with the 3 stars, or the 3 Great Pyramids.
What do you mean by lining up, though?
By as in being in alignment over the things, is like
at a certain time.
At a certain time. The Sphinx facing due east on the horizon, lining up with Leo, and the Nile and the Milky Way meeting on the horizon.
The north thing is easy. You wait for a solstice, equinox, not solstice, and you have the sun at noon is right at the top, and you cast a shadow pointing north. Plus, at night, you have Polaris. At the time, it wouldn't have been Polaris, but it doesn't matter. Whatever the pole star is, you have that. So you can get, to me, the pyramids pointing north is not that big of a mystery. So this would be pretty interesting.
The thing is, these stars are so bright that when you walk outside, even with light pollution, you can still see them. They are so visible. They are the most visible stars in the night sky. Now, they aren't the most visible, because the most visible is Sirius and then Canopus. But if you're looking for a constellation, these 3, you can easily go outside and look up in the night sky and go, oh, okay, there they are, bang, bang, bang.
The ancient Egyptians called the Orion constellation Sahu, and they recognize it as the celestial image of the god Osiris. So what's being copied on the ground is the belt of a deity, of a celestial deity. It's not just a random constellation. When we take precession into account, you find something else very intriguing happening. You find that the exact orientation of the pyramids as it is today, and pretty much as it was when they're supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago, it's not precisely related to how Orion's belt looked at that time. They're not quite right. But as you precess the stars backwards, and you come to around 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, in the Younger Dryas, you find that suddenly they lock perfectly. They match perfectly with the 3 pyramids on the ground. And that's the same moment that the Great Sphinx, an equinoctial monument, aligned perfectly to the rising sun on the spring equinox. Anybody can test this for themselves. Just go to Giza on the 21st of March, be there before dawn, stand behind the Sphinx, and you will see the sun rising directly in line with the gaze of the Sphinx. And actually, the constellation of Leo has a very Sphinx-like look. Over the thousands of years, it became damaged, it became eroded, particularly the part of it that sticks out the head.
So you can see this early picture when they first got to Egypt and they saw the Sphinx. Look how much sand is up to the second pyramid. Like, it's covered. They had to scrape all this sand out so you can see what it is today, and you can see the platforms and the bases of everything. So it would have been covered up to its neck in sand. So that's why there's so much erosion on the head. And then the enclosure isn't even visible in this image because it's covered in sand. And the key thing in this is he's saying the monument looks like a lion. It's the body of a lion, but the head of an Egyptian pharaoh. And it's a lot smaller. You can see the head is a lot smaller than the body when you see it in images, which means that it looks like they're saying that it's a recarved head from a lion head to an Egyptian pharaoh like this. And it's not Khafre's face as we've seen before.
Create an equinoctial marker in the time of Khafre 4,500 years ago. You'd be more likely to create it in the shape of a bull, because that was the age of Taurus, when the constellation of Taurus housed the sun on the spring equinox. So why is it a lion? Putting on the ground, as above, so below, putting on the ground an image of the sky.
Now, this is from Graham Hancock's book, Magicians of the Gods. And look at the image here. So that's Leo, the constellation, and it kind of does, if you map out those points in the sky, those stars, it looks like what the Sphinx looks like. It's sitting with its paws in front of it, with the head up, and if it was built at the time of Khafre, it would have been facing Taurus. So you would have built it in the form of a bull or whatever they would have seen Taurus as. The Egyptians do have images of bulls around the place, so they know how to do this, and they would have done it if it was the form of a bull, but they didn't. They did it in the form of a lion, whoever made the Sphinx. And he's saying to mark this epoch of 10,500 BC, because looking east in the dawn, about an hour before sunrise on the morning of the spring equinox in the epoch of 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, we see the constellation of Leo lying with its belly on the horizon directly in line with the gaze of the Sphinx. That's the equinoctial marker he's talking about. And there are so many around the world. The US has a bunch. There's Serpent Mound, which he goes into in another book, America Before. And there's so many around the whole world, equinoctial markers. The ancient people, like super ancient people we're talking about 10 plus thousand years ago, were tracking the heavens and the stars and the sunrise. It's clear. It's clear as day. All you need to do is look at the evidence. Only someone who hasn't looked at the evidence would sit here and say the mainstream narrative is correct based on listening to the mainstream narrative. And now this is talking about precession. So we were talking about precession before, so they can tell when the stars move in the sky and how far they are moving and how long it takes to move. Only in one epoch in the last 25,920 years has the lion-bodied Sphinx looked out at its own celestial counterpart, the constellation of Leo, in the pre-dawn on the spring equinox, and that epoch was of 10,500 BC. But in that same epoch at the bottom, at the exact moment the sun bisected the horizon due east, 3 belt stars of the constellation Orion lay due south on the meridian, and they did so in a pattern that very precisely matches the pattern of the 3 great pyramids on the ground. So he's talking about Leo is out here in the east, and then down to the south is Orion. So it's marking out an L shape or a 90-degree angle between Orion and Leo, and it marks it at 10,500 BC. That's not saying the pyramids are built then, it's saying they're marking that time period for a reason. And now we're going to go back to Gnostic, talking about how easy it is to build the pyramids to true north.
Today we can do it perfectly. I think it's off by a little bit.
Exactly what it's off is 3/60ths of a single degree to true north. That's how far off true north, whoever built the pyramids, or the base structure of the pyramids, that's how far off true north they were.
But it's not perfect. But which is still a very
but we squared it
mind-blowing that they can do that. But it doesn't seem like, it seems like they're doing it by eye.
I actually wanted to check how accurate is 3/60th of a single degree compared to modern surveying. And it says 3 arc minutes or 0.05 degrees from true north is an exceptionally accurate measurement. Modern surveying, 3 arc minutes, is well within modern precision requirements for architectural and construction surveying. That's within today's requirements.
Even with the zodiac being known to the Babylonians and the Sumerians, actually, we still don't have any like indication of them being knowledgeable of the precession of the equinoxes until the time of Eratosthenes in the 3rd century.
Now he's talking about written textual evidence, but I would say the archaeoastronomical alignments that we're seeing and the evidence that we're seeing from archaeoastronomy with all of these monuments, not just this one, but all around the world, we knew they were doing it thousands and thousands of years ago. There are too many monuments on the earth to show us that they were doing it. Just because it wasn't written down in a language that probably never existed that we can read doesn't mean it didn't happen, because we have the monuments right here.
Because that takes a lot of time and recording to understand about the wobble and the...
Takes thousands and thousands of years.
You bring up another problem, in my opinion, is language, writing.
As I just said, he doesn't like that there's no language or writing that proves this. The language they used was mathematics and astronomy, and the writing they used were the monuments. Let's talk about precession. So the heartbeat of the cycle, as we've seen, is 72. The number of years required for the unfolding of 1 degree, just 1 degree. Now that is this. 1 degree of precessional arc is about the width of a finger, like that. Basically, 1 whole lifetime is 1 finger's worth of movement in the sky. That's how much time we're talking about. So a 30-degree shift through 1 entire zodiacal constellation requiring 30 times 72 is 2,160 years to complete. And that means right now, because the last 2,000 years we've been in Pisces and we're moving into Aquarius. So it takes 2,160 years to move into a new constellation. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. And it's impossible to miss. if you're watching it for thousands of years. But its progression could only have been precisely recorded and noted by many generations of conscientious and accurate observers. A 60-degree shift through 2 zodiacal constellations takes 4,320 years. Okay, 4320, which is why a 360-degree shift, all 12 constellations, or what's called the Great Year, requires a grand total of 25,920 years. It might look like a lot of text, but this is the most important thing because it talks about the King's Chamber and the mathematics involved in the Great Pyramid. Now it says the King's Chamber, its derivation from the 3-4-5 triangle inside the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid is therefore most unlikely to be an accident, and the relationship of all this to astronomy and geodesy, earth measuring, is clear. Now, they have a 3-4-5 triangle inside the King's Chamber, so they knew complex mathematics. And now, if you take that same number, 4320, and you times by 10, so 43,200, watch this. If you measure the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth, from the pole to the equator. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by that same number, 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Based in the Great Pyramid's mathematics is a measurement that contains the size of the Earth to a scale of 1 to 43,200. How the fuck did they work that out? If they don't know how to calculate, they can't travel the Earth, they don't know the planet is a sphere, they've given us the dimensions of our planet in the Great Pyramid's mathematics. That is insane to me. And if it doesn't strike you as being just crazy that they knew this and they gave it to us to pass down in history. So here's going to be a clip from the Netflix show, for Graham Hancock's Netflix show, Ancient Apocalypse, and it's going to be talking about Malta and the fact that they knew precession and that the fact that they tracked the stars and built temples to track the stars, and over a very, very long period of time.
At the height of the last ice age, the level of the world's oceans was about 120 meters, 400 feet, lower than it is today. And the Maltese Islands used to be hilltops, part of a single continuous landmass that connected Malta all the way to present-day Sicily, and from there to the southern end of Italy and the European mainland.
I had been working to check, and then all of a sudden it appeared the temples were orientated to one star.
Sirius.
Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, 2 times as bright as the next brightest, which is Canopus. You can see it as clear as night every time you walk outside, and you see it, and then you look at the belt stars of Orion.
It passes all the entrances. At some point in time, all the temples fitted.
As Sirius shifted position over time, it fell out of each temple's line of sight, forcing the architects to build a new one.
Now, it depends on how much of a narrow window or how big the window was they had to look at Sirius, because as you remember, 1 degree is basically a whole lifetime. So if they're making multiple temples, then that means they were watching it for thousands and thousands of years. That are all facing different directions, but they all face Sirius at one point in time.
Because of precession, Sirius hadn't been visible from Malta for thousands of years, until the Earth's wobble brought it spectacularly back into view around 11,000 years ago. It means that Malta's megalithic project began thousands of years before those Stone Age farmers from Sicily arrived on the island.
So the Stone Age people, they're saying we're around 6,000 BC, around about 6,000 BC. So they're saying, oh, this is when the first people came to Malta on boats. So about 20,000 years ago, 18,000 BC, people could walk from Italy and the European mainland to get to Malta. So there could be other structures and other temples underwater. Look where they built it. There's one right on the edge here, and there's a couple right on the edge, and there's another one on the edge here. All right, now going back to the podcast, we're going to look at how accurate the distances are of the sides of the pyramid.
756 feet each side with about a 2-inch to 3-inch variation.
On the pyramids?
Yeah.
Oh, they're it's not perfectly. They're definitely off by like feet.
They're definitely off by feet. Okay.
The perimeter of the Great Pyramid.
Yeah. It's not perfect.
It's goddamn close.
No.
No. Dismissive. Very dismissive. He knows better. He knows more than anyone else. No.
756 feet per side with a few inches variation.
No, that's not. My understanding is that it's off by like feet. Like, what's the evidence?
Well, your understanding is off by more than feet.
Ask Rock, maybe?
But I think
are the sides of the Great Pyramid equal?
0.1 meters is 3 inches.
So yeah, that's about what I was saying.
That really is 3 inches? They're definitely off by like feet. I think it's a couple of feet.
No, it's 3 inches. Yeah, it's like 3.6.
Ask how many feet differences is that? But if you had lasers, you'd be like spot on.
If you had lasers, you'd be spot on. But no one's saying they had lasers. And now look at how far off they are when they put it into Grok. It's saying the longest versus the shortest is 7.9 inches. Okay, 7.9 inches. South versus east, 2.5 inches off. South versus west, 3.8 inches. East and north, 5.4. West and north, 4.1. East and west, 1.3 inches between east and west. Wow. And it says all variations stay well under 9 inches total. Relative to the average side length, this is an error of less than 0.1%. Exceptionally precise for ancient construction on a massive scale. So it's inches, not definitely feet.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
They know where it was, right?
There's a ditch.
Yeah, so they use that where it was.
To the inch, though? I mean...
Yeah. They're definitely off by like feet.
To the inch, though? I mean...
Yeah.
Well, here's...
Yeah, oh, whoops. That's one of those deep breaths you take and you go, oh, well, I fucked up there. Here's another one he's going to stuff up. So he's going to say, oh, Graham Hancock said it's 10,000 BC, didn't he? Well, and then I'll show you exactly what Graham Hancock says.
I thought Graham Hancock says that they're from 10,000 BC. Like, what's the evidence?
I would never seek to divorce the dynastic ancient Egyptians from the Great Pyramids.
There you go. He would never seek to divorce the dynastic Egyptians from the Great Pyramids. Gnostic just hears, oh, he said 10,500 or 10,000 BC, so he believes it's 10,000 BC. What does he actually say? What does he actually put in his books? See what happens when you have a mainstream person sitting there defending a narrative that just is based on zero evidence?
They were closely involved in the construction of the Great Pyramids as we see them today.
Now, this is Graham Hancock's book again, Magicians of the Gods. From a purely astronomical point of view, what can be said about the huge effort and endeavor of the Giza monuments is that the ground plan of the pyramids and the Sphinx does speak clearly of the epoch of 10,500 BC. But as readers of my previous books will be aware, the monuments also include features such as the 4 narrow shafts angled up through the body of the Great Pyramid that target significant stars in the epoch of 2500 BC, when Egyptologists believed the pyramids were built. In other words, both epochs are symbolized, 2500 BC by the shafts and 10,500 BC by the ground plan. There you go.
What I do suggest is that there were very low platforms on the Giza Plateau that are much older, and that when we look at the 3 Great Pyramids, we're looking at a renovation and a restoration and a enhancement of much older structures that had existed on the Giza Plateau for a much longer period before that. Actually, the Great Pyramid is built around a natural hill.
So there it is. The Great Pyramid is built around a natural hill. Now he goes on to say it could be the primeval mound that the Egyptians talk about during Zeptepi and like the creation of the original land. But I'm not going to go into that here. That's just what he says. The next bit we're going to bring up is the carbon dating and the evidence that Gnostic brings up to prove the Giza pyramids were built in 2500 BC. He's going to cite a scientific paper with 10 PhD or 10 scholars or whatever, and we're going to take a look at that actual study and see what it actually says.
Hill.
This is the big one. This gives us a terminus post quem, in my opinion. We can't go farther than this now. So we can't go after the 6th dynasty claiming that this is... We can't go... In my opinion, the carbon dating says we cannot go back to 10,000 BC because the organic material is in the mortar, and the mortar goes all the way down to the beginning, the bottom layers of the pyramid, in the core of the pyramid, and that mortar carbon dates to exactly the reign of Khufu.
No, it does not.
Yes, it does. 10 academics right there. 10 professors, peer-reviewed paper right there. That's what I'm citing. All of them say that it goes exactly to the reign of Khufu. Like, what's the evidence?
Okay, glad you asked, Gnostic. What's the evidence for what you're citing? Okay, now this is a screenshot I took of the paper, and you can see right here it says mortar. I did a word search for mortar because he put carbon dating of organic material found within the mortar and associated worker camps confirms the Egyptian pyramids were built roughly 4,500 years ago during the Old Kingdom. Now he's written this on the left side. He's written this because what does it actually say? If you do a word search for mortar on the site, on the paper, there is absolutely nothing. 0 of 0 hits right up here. There is nothing about the mortar in this paper. And then if you go and do a search, which I did for the Great Pyramid, the only reference to the Great Pyramid in this paper says carbon-14 dating has been applied to ancient Egyptian history ever since the development of the method. Now, examples include the results obtained on the coffin of the famous King Tutankhamun and the funerary boat of King Khufu adjacent to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Nothing to do with the mortar or the dating of the pyramids inside the pyramids, all right? Or the bricks, the mortar inside the bricks of the pyramids. Doesn't say that at all. What does the actual paper cite? Because if you go to the first figure, which shows you every piece of data collection that they used to date, what does it say? It's from the World Museum in Liverpool, and it's a piece of bone from a person. The next bit is from the same place, and it's textile from the same person. The Petrie Museum in London, a linen from this place. Another one from the Petrie Museum, another piece of linen from Deshashe. Cambridge University plant remains from Saqqara, the Pyramid of Unas. The Petrie Museum, linen again from Deshashe. 5th or 6th dynasty, 5th or 6th dynasty, 5th or 6th, okay, not the Great Pyramid or the Giza Pyramids. Look at the next, I'll just go through it. Petrie, papyrus from another pyramid in Abu Sir. Linen from Saqqara. Linen from Saqqara. Bone from Abydos. Bone from Abydos and bone from Abydos. This paper says nothing about the mortar being dated to the 4th dynasty. I don't know what he's doing. Is he lying to you? Or did he not read the paper and this is where the data is coming from? Talking about the boat next, the Khufu's boat next to the Great Pyramid. Talking about Tutankhamun. And none of these pieces of evidence that they pulled out from their collection data has anything to do with the Great Pyramid or the Giza Pyramids. Because the first one is from this person, this individual here. Bone from this person. Linen or textile from this person again. More linen from Deshashe. It's a village 130 kilometers south of Cairo. Plant remains from the Pyramid of Unas in Saqqara, 30 k's south of Cairo. Closer to the pyramids, but not the pyramids. Abu Sir, 25 k's closer to the pyramids, but still not the pyramids. 25 k's southwest of Cairo. This has nothing to do with the Great Pyramids. 3 pieces of bone from Abydos, which is well down near Luxor. Nothing to do with the Great Pyramids. There's nothing to do with mortar in this. And then even if you go to the next piece of evidence, the next table, with the tree ring dating, it's from the fortress of Uranati in Sudan, well away from Cairo and the pyramids, in another country. So he's literally just written this next to this paper, which they didn't pull up, by the way, and look into, because if you looked into it for 2 seconds, you would see this has nothing to do with what he's talking about. So he's pulling up evidence that doesn't exist in this paper, but he wants to cite, 10 scholars. Now that was the screenshots of the paper. Now, this is what's in the actual paper, which I'm looking at right now, okay? This is very interesting. Most important so-called Sothic records, which describe the heliacal rising of the star Sirius. They're following Sirius, just like we saw in Malta. They're following the brightest star in the night sky. Look, we'll do it right now. I'll do it live. Look. Mortar. Nothing to do with mortar. Great Pyramid. What's got to do with Great Pyramid? Great as a century in the abstract. Great Pyramid of Giza. Boat of King Khufu. Greater insight in the conclusion. The wooden beams of Uranati. This is the wooden beams of Sudan. This paper says nothing about what he's saying it is. Our results continue to underscore the congruence between 4,200 aridification event, that's the time period, and political fragmentation, but that's got nothing to do with the pyramid. Reign length configurations, they're talking about trying to configure the data on how long a reign is. Table 1, the materials and methods. Nothing to do with the pyramids. He's making it up. Let's go. 4 references to pyramid. Pyramid age. Pyramid age. They talk about the Minoan eruption of Thera, Santorini. The only reference to the Great Pyramid is right here. astronomical orientation of the pyramids. They're even citing that. Look at what it says. The paper that they are citing, which I've just pulled up right now, which I haven't looked at before, says in the abstract, Kate Spence, published in November 2000, the ancient Egyptian pyramids at Giza have never been accurately dated. Boom. Thank you. Although we know that they were built approximately around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. The chronologies of this period have been reconstructed from surviving lists of kings and the lengths of their reigns, but the lists are seldom complete and contain known inconsistencies and errors. As a result, the existing chronologies for that period, the Old Kingdom, can be considered accurate only to about 100 plus or minus years, a figure that radiocarbon dating cannot, at present, improve. This was in 2000. So she's modeling the precession of stars that yield a date for the start of construction that is accurate to within 5 plus or minus years, thereby providing an anchor for the Old Kingdom chronologies. Which is what we just said Graham Hancock was showing, that the star alignments from the shafts do point to the Old Kingdom. And this is in 2000. Never been accurately dated. This is the paper that they're citing that Gnostic is bringing up to say that the pyramids mortar, he's saying that the mortar in the pyramids has been dated according to this paper. Nothing in this paper has anything to do with that.
The wood that has a different dating problem with like 100 to 200 years later. Like, what's the evidence?
Glad you asked again. What's the evidence? Now, the wood he's talking about was Uranati, which is from Sudan, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But I did find another paper called Pyramidology and Radiocarbon, the dating and interpretation of a fragment of wood from the Great Pyramid. This one is interesting, and it does change things a bit. Now it says, during an investigation of the Great Pyramid in 1872 by Dixon and Grant, 2 narrow shafts from the Queen's Chamber were discovered. In them were items including a copper alloy hook, a stone ball, and a fragment of wood. So it's very interesting that they all, when it all goes back to Egypt, they're all citing, trying to prove biblical accuracy in history. Very interesting. The collection went to the University of Aberdeen, which will have a look at what they concluded with the wood. But it says his work was part of the development of a scientific Egyptology back in 1872, with its roots in a desire to reconcile biblical history with archaeology. So back then they're trying to reconcile biblical history and archaeology because the two things do not make sense. The biblical side references Israel 3,000 times in the Septuagint, but we only get scattered evidence, possible evidence of it saying a reference to Israel back in Egypt. So they're trying to reconcile the differences in between biblical knowledge and actual archaeology where there is very, very scant evidence. And now here's the University of Aberdeen, Pyramidology and Radiocarbon, the dating and interpretation of a fragment of wood from the Great Pyramid. This is the wood that was found in the Queen's Chamber. A fragment of wood from the Great Pyramid was recently dated by the University of Aberdeen to 3341, 3094 calibrated BC. That's about 500 to 800 years older than what the pyramids are actually supposed to be built at. So they're saying, oh, they're using old wood. That would make sense. But the wood is 5 to 800 years old that they're using to put in the Queen's Chamber. So the problem is that it's 5 to 800 years older than what the pyramids are supposed to be built at.
The reason why I have terminus post quem there is because even if you wanted to say, but the wood goes back another 100 to 200 years.
500 to 800, as we just saw, according to the University of Aberdeen. In the wood we're talking about with the Queen's Chamber, not the wood he's talking about in the paper that we just looked at, which has nothing to do with the Queen's Chamber.
You still have to deal with the other mortar,
which doesn't exist.
You're saying that all the carbon dating is older than the pyramid. That's not true.
Hang on.
Like, what's the evidence?
But we just looked at the carbon dating, and what does it say? Calibrated date for this sample at 95.4% probability is the rather large range of 3341 to 3094 calibrated BC, 5 to 800 years more than Khufu.
No offense, Dan, but why would I not? If I have 20 Egyptologists, archaeologists, anthropologists telling me that the carbon dating is spot on,
I pull the paper up and
you're telling me the opposite. Why would I go? Oh, okay.
It's funny because he's the one that's saying the opposite by citing people who don't say anything about what he's talking about.
Figured it out.
You pull this one up, even it's going to cite it anytime that.
Yeah, this one right here, who has 10 PhDs.
10 PhDs that don't talk about anything you brought up, and You wrote your own thing here to make something up that doesn't exist in this paper at all, as we just looked at. Doesn't exist. You just made it up. There's nothing about the mortar.
You think the pyramids are 200 years older than Khufu?
Then
that's all. That's the only other option you have if you're going to go with that.
Well, no, it's not, because the wood that was found in the Queen's Chamber we just looked at, 500 to 800 years. That's a possibility based on the carbon dating. Are you going to sit there and say you don't want to look at the evidence, or you say it's old wood? It's like, don't worry about the carbon dates. You want to pull the carbon dates to say the mortar is this, but then when the carbon dates come back and it says it's older than what you think it is, just dismiss it and say it's old wood, reused wood. Well, aren't you open to evidence, or are you just talking shit?
Carbon dating's off by 200 years.
I would ask what the evidence is.
I would ask you what the evidence is right there. I just showed you again.
You have to ignore all of the other evidence to get to what you're getting at.
Telling on himself, you have to ignore all the other evidence that says it's older, while producing evidence that says nothing about what you're saying it says. I think that's called gaslighting.
Yeah. Two options: either it's reused wood, which makes a lot of sense, or the pyramids are a little bit older than we thought, but we're still not talking thousands of years.
But that is in alignment with Graham Hancock and Zahi Hawass. Yeah,
I thought Graham Hancock says that they're from 10,000 BC.
So yeah, we already looked at this bit. 2500 BC for the shafts, 10,500 BC for the ground plan. You would know if you actually watched and read his work instead of just listen to other people say nonsense about it.
But I thought Khufu's people were the ones who are fixing or repairing.
Fixing or repairing, not building. He even said that.
Sorry.
You're saying that they built these pyramids 200 years before Khufu, and then all these workers start showing up 200 years later claiming to build these pyramids.
It would make more sense if it was 500 to 800 years and there's been some weathering and erosion and they've got to fix some of the limestone casings, which we'll have a look at.
And there's graffiti and inscription saying Khufu built this pyramid, but really they're just all lying. It's 200 years older. We've always thought, just think about this. Imagine you're in 2013. And this is the reason why I showed this last, is because our collective knowledge as amateurs and scholars alike, we've always been thinking Khufu. And then one day we discover a papyrus that literally says it's Khufu.
So here's what's on the Internet Archive where you can go look at this and watch the video of a guy who does a translation of it, and he reads it in English. What does it say down here, down the bottom? This is the Diary of Mera. And it says, the oldest written papyrus discovered takes the form of a daily logbook of an Inspector Mera, whose job is to transport limestone from the nearby Tura quarry to use as cladding for the pyramids in the construction's final stages. This proves that it's a major construction over hundreds of years. Based on the wood we've just looked at, based on the timing it takes to build this thing, and they're saying it's the final stages. So if the wood is even 200 years older, or 500 to 800 years older, and it's being put in the Queen's Chamber, and they're saying in 2500, 500 to 800 years later, or even 1 to 200, they're still building it. So it's not the 25-year period that the standard model of Egyptology tells you Khufu built it in his reign in 25 years. And we'll look at the numbers of how ridiculous that is to have built in 25 years. So even this right here proves to me, based on all the dating and everything we've got, that it was a construction period of over centuries, at least centuries. But the key point in this is he's transporting limestone, not granite, because there's no way that they would be able to transport granite with the boats that they had at the time, which we just saw Khufu's boat was found next to the Great Pyramid. Because what does it say? The massive granite blocks and beams used to build the Great Pyramid in the King's Chamber, and its relieving chambers weigh between 50 to 80 tons. 50 to 80 tons, okay? You're not carrying that on Khufu's boat. I will show you. Down the very bottom, this makes sense, and it's from PBS. For context, the vast majority of the core limestone blocks throughout the rest of the pyramid weigh an average of just 2.5 tons. I can see a limestone block, or a few of them, being put onto the boat, the Khufu boat, if they're 2.5 tons and a bit more. You can do that with this boat, but you absolutely cannot do that with 50 to 80 ton granite blocks. No way, not on the boats they have. So this next bit is going to kind of touch on some other things that happen in the world of classics, and I'm going to show you what he did in that instance on his own show in looking at the podcast and breaking it down.
To me, it's a smoking gun. And unless you think this is a forgery or somehow they faked this whole thing, good luck going with that route, because then I just can't take you seriously at that point.
So he said, if you're saying the text is a forgery, he can't take you seriously. All right? Look at what he says about a classicist who said the exact same thing about ancient Greek texts.
And you and I are watching this going, this is embarrassing.
Yeah,
this is
very
horrible.
one-sided. Yeah,
this is like Luke is destroying him.
Texts lie. I don't know if you know this, but sometimes texts lie. Actually, usually texts lie.
Good luck going with that route, because then I just can't take you seriously at that point.
So he said this guy Luke was destroying Armin Hilm and the other guy in the debate on classics in ancient Greek texts. This guy Luke is the one that said usually texts lie. Gnostic said, if you're saying that, I can't take you seriously. Hello?
Usually text lie.
Good luck going with that route, because then I just can't take you seriously at that point.
And this bit is when he gaslights his audience while trying to say the other person is gaslighting his audience. Projection.
Then you look at the comments, and there's people who actually were like, it's guesswork. It's guesswork. Because they're repeating the slogan. This is kind of the gaslighting you see. And he kept going, so you're saying it's guesswork? And he's like, no, I'm not saying it's guesswork. I'm saying this is where the evidence is. This is what we know.
We don't know.
This is what we know.
We don't know. We don't even know. Let's back up and talk about methodology again. What we're dealing with usually is probabilities. Anything we do is guessing. For the 1,000th time, we're guessing about everything. Everything is speculation. We don't know anything for sure.
So the guy he said was destroying in a debate, he said, we're guessing about everything. Everything's speculation. We don't know anything for sure. I've done multiple videos on this. It's just hilarious that Gnostic is sitting there saying, I can't take you seriously if you're claiming this text is forged or a fake, while he's sitting there on the other hand praising this guy by gaslighting you into thinking that he's asking for evidence when he's literally saying
anything we do is guessing. For the 1,000th time, we're guessing about everything.
Anything we do is guessing.
For the 1,000th time, we're guessing about everything.
We're guessing about everything. Like he literally just said, we're guessing about everything. This is how Gnostic plays both sides. On the one hand, if you're saying this text is a forgery in ancient Egyptian, he can't take you seriously. On the other hand, he's praising Luke for saying everything is speculation and everything we do is guessing. See, this is the type of dude he is, and I've shown this before.
I think for sure.
I just can't take you seriously.
This is why I can't take him seriously now at this point, because he's saying one thing on one hand and one thing on the other when it suits his narrative.
I just can't take you seriously.
This proves they were definitely doing it.
And they're definitely, for at the very least, what you can say about this, it doesn't tell you how they lifted the blocks on the pyramid or how they constructed the pyramid.
Exactly. It doesn't tell you how they lifted it. It doesn't tell you how they constructed it, because that shit was already done.
But it tells you that they were bringing blocks from this quarry at Tura to the Giza Plateau.
You notice that he left out limestone in his own writing on this bit, because he wrote it on the left again. So the Pyramid of Khufu, Akhet Khufu, yeah, so they say that. But he conveniently leaves out that the Tura blocks that they're bringing is limestone, and it's about 2.5 tons on average that I showed you. Conveniently leaves that out. Like he conveniently put in the mortar is dated to Khufu's reign when it says nothing about mortar in the evidence he brought up before.
Yeah, you're saying blocks, but they're saying stones. So blocks is implying that it's the cubes.
They cut the stone, I believe, in the quarry. So they would cut the stone there. And I think there's, I don't have it on here. I think there's a mention of the cutting on here too. But I'm not, but I could be wrong. Let's just maybe just not even bring that up.
Yeah, but that's I
could be wrong.
Let's just not bring that up. And then Dan laughs because he's like, he even sees through the shit show. He's like, let's just backpedal. Let's not bring that up. Shut the hell up. I just overstepped where I shouldn't have.
Okay, I was wrong about that.
We're coming from Torah. Could this be the casing stones, the Torah limestone casing stones? Is my
literally says loading limestone blocks onto boats, hauling limestone on the first and second line.
Question.
That's a good question.
Yeah,
I'm not going to sit there and pretend I have the answer.
The answer's literally in the line right here: hauling limestone, loading limestone blocks. Now, this is the ship that they found next to the Great Pyramid, yeah? The Khufu ship, one of the oldest, largest, and best preserved vessels from antiquity. The ship was one of 2 rediscovered in 1954, undisturbed since it was sealed into a pit carved out of the Giza bedrock. That's why they say, oh, he built it. It's like, we've already shown that it was constructed over a long period of time, based on the evidence I've already shown. And we know that Egyptians, especially the dynastic Egyptians who were pharaohs, were egomaniacs, so they would want to put himself right next to the pyramid because it's the greatest pyramid of all time. We know these people were egomaniacs. They're humans. And what happens when you put someone who's an egomaniac in power, in control of a dynasty? Crazy shit happens. Now let's take a look at how much weight could this boat carry. If it's carrying blocks from Tura, which is limestone, which is about 2.5 tons, how much could this boat carry? Likely carry 10 to 20 metric tons, with total displacement calculated around 40 to 45 metric tons. It says it would easily carry the 10 to 20 tons of ceremonial cargo before reaching its waterline limit. Down the bottom, open water construction crane. It was designed to carry heavy stone blocks weighing 2 to 3 tons at a time. Yeah, that's limestone. That's not 50 to 80 tons of granite, which we saw before. It's saying it was designed to carry blocks weighing 2 to 3 tons at a time, not 50 to 80. All the evidence in this is saying it's not possible to do what they're doing in the mainstream Egyptological narrative.
Above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid are 5 further chambers. And these chambers are roofed and floored with granite beams that weigh about 70 tons each, been elevated to a height of more than 350 feet above the ground and carefully and precisely placed in position. It is very hard for archaeologists to explain how that was done using purely leverage and mechanical advantage. You can say, oh, perhaps they built a ramp and hauled the stones up the ramp. But then you have to confront basic laws of physics. You can't haul a stone weighing tens of tons up a slope that exceeds 10 degrees.
Okay, you heard it right there. You can't haul a stone that heavy up a slope more than 10 degrees. Now this one is a piece of evidence that Gnostic brought up, Sekhemkhet's unfinished pyramid. And you can clearly see the ramp that they used to bring the stones up. But look right here. Look at these tiny blocks in this wall. These are the blocks we're talking about to be building the one we're talking about here. Not giant 70 to 80 ton stones of granite. There's no way. And this is the evidence he's bringing up.
That's the evidence of the ramp at Saqqara. Mm-hmm. There's a pyramid that was unfinished with a ramp leading up to it. So we know they use ramps.
Yeah, with small stones that didn't even get finished.
The next one is another papyri, or an ostraca, showing the calculations they made for the ramp.
Yeah, for a tiny ramp to move stones that weighed nowhere near the amount that are in the granite beams in the King's Chamber. Nowhere near. And look how they built this. They didn't even finish it. Are you telling me this is the same kind of construction methods or abilities as the Great Pyramid?
Then you start doing the calculation. How long a ramp do I need with a 10-degree slope to get to 350 feet above the ground? And the answer is you need a fucking long ramp, which should still be there.
Exactly, it should still be there. If it's that big, even the little one we just saw at Saqqara is still there. That ramp is still there. So if they hauled the stones up to the King's Chamber with a ramp like this, you would see it. It would be gigantic, but it's not there.
The chambers above the King's Chambers, and each one of those floors consists of a row of 70-ton granite blocks that have been raised 350 feet above the ground. And not only that, but brought from Aswan in the south of Egypt, 500 kilometers south of the Great Pyramid.
500 kilometers south, 70 to 80 tons each. Nearly 600 tons per line. Oh my God. And they're bringing it from 500 kilometers away. There is no way the Khufu boat is moving these on the Nile from Aswan to Giza. No way.
This is huge. The sarcophagus. People say it's not a tomb. How can it not be a tomb when it was built around the sarcophagus? You could not get the sarcophagus in there. Petrie said himself, the coffer could not have been put into the pyramid after the King's Chamber was finished, because it's wider than the beginning of the ascending passage. The only conclusion then is that the coffer was placed in the King's Chamber before the roof was put on.
Yeah, like that's... No one has ever said this was brought in after. A lot of people have said this would have been put there before. Like many alternative people have said this. And like ones that are way out there talking about like, you know, stuff that I'm not going to go into here because that's not the video this is about. This is about disproving the mainstream evidence based on their own basic evidence that they're pushing. No one's ever said that this granite box, that is it a sarcophagus? You can fit in there, yes, but there's no evidence that's really the evidence that it's a sarcophagus just because it doesn't fit up the narrow passageway to get into the King's Chamber doesn't prove that it's a coffin or a sarcophagus. That doesn't prove that. And I mean, look at the walls behind it and around it. Look at these giant, look at this stone, this giant granite block. Look at them all, perfectly cut to fit. They're not all exactly the same length and size and breadth and width. They're not. Because this one right next to this one is smaller. Because if you have a giant quarry, you could cut uniformitarian stone. You could cut it to the exact, and you have the ability to cut granite like this. You could cut the stone exactly the same length, exactly the same height, and make it uniform all around the king's chamber. But they didn't do that. There's different sizes, different weights as well. And the key thing is, if you look at any ancient Egyptian tomb, it is covered wall to wall in hieroglyphs, painting, colorful like stars, everything, because it's supposed to be the passageway for the pharaoh to get to the afterlife. Does this look like an ancient Egyptian tomb to you? It doesn't to me. It doesn't to me, based on other ancient Egyptian tombs that I have seen and that I have studied. Even in high school, they teach us what the ancient Egyptians have in their tombs. And this is not it.
So this has to be, you can disagree on if it's a coffin or not, but you have to at least agree that the coffin was there first. Yeah. It was built around the coffin.
Yeah, but why does that make it a coffin?
Because all the other coffins look exactly the same as this.
No, they don't.
Yes, they do. They look identical. I was there myself. I could fit perfectly inside there if I wanted to.
This doesn't make it a coffin.
Yeah. What else would it be?
What else would it be? See, that's the thing. What else would it be? And when you don't have an answer for what else it could be, they just say, well, see, you don't have an answer for what it could be, therefore I'm right. It's like, no, that's not how evidence works. Just because you don't have an answer for something doesn't mean yours is right because it can't fit into the room up the ascending passageway. That does not make it a coffin at all. Good for these guys calling him out on this bullshit.
I don't know, but I'm just, but your all point is that it's too big to get in there.
You know what else is interesting? You know, the Queen's Chamber. The Queen's Chamber does not have a coffin in it. So if it was built to house Khufu and his family, or at least Khufu and his wife, well, why does the Queen's Chamber not have a coffin if it was built to be the resting place of the pharaoh and his family? Which is what we see in other periods of dynastic Egypt. They bury the families in giant tombs, but beautifully decorated tombs, not like this. So if the Queen's Chamber was supposed to be built as a Queen's Chamber, just like the King's Chamber, you would think that the sarcophagus would be in the Queen's Chamber already. But it isn't. There isn't one there. What the hell is that about?
That doesn't make it a coffin.
No, but if they're building around it, means that was there first. And if all the other coffins from that dynasty, the dynasty prior and the dynasty after, have identical coffins.
I'm not saying it wasn't a coffin. Yeah. I'm not saying it wasn't a coffin. I'm just saying that because it couldn't fit through the door doesn't make it a coffin. That's all I'm saying.
You have whatever you want to say it is, you can't say that was added later.
No one ever said that it was added later. We can see there's a tiny square passage. You would have seen it when you go into, because he's been there, when you go into the King's Chamber. There's no way you could have fit it in there. No one that I know has ever said, hey, yeah, it was put into the thing, therefore that makes it a coffin. Like, this is ridiculous.
Right. First. Okay.
100%. 100%.
Keep going.
Yeah.
I think there's a
But
couple
that doesn't
more.
make it a coffin.
Yeah, it doesn't make it a coffin. So now we're going to get into the Howard Weiss issue with this right here. The Khufu inscription. You want to call it the worker gang of Khufu inscription, which if you ever watch Stargate, they actually referenced this back in the 90s, okay? Which is interesting because Shock went there and detailed this in the 90s. In Stargate, the guy says, the archaeologist or whatever Egyptologist says to Spader's character, no, they found a cartouche with Khufu's name in the pyramid. And then he says, yeah, well, Howard Weiss was a fraud. And that's what this is talking about. And they said it back in the Stargate, the movie. So it's interesting that this has been going on since the 90s. Since the 90s, it's been in popular culture. That was just another interesting thing that I noticed back when I saw the movie. But this was a photo from Robert Schoch, who we've looked at already, talking about the Sphinx and the erosion on the Sphinx. Now, you can see here that they say, oh, more evidence is because look where it is. It's gone under the stone, and then they put the stone on top. Doesn't really prove that because we can't see under the stone. So you could have, whoever's done it, could have painted it. If Weiss or his team did it to forge it, they could have painted it there to make it look like it goes underneath. We'll have a look at the details in the photo. This is the cartouche of Khufu painted in the Great Pyramid. And this is the evidence they're saying to say, oh, he built the pyramid, it's Khufu's pyramid, and this is it. This is one of the biggest pieces of evidence they have. And so this is it on the other angle, so you can have a look at that, pause that, go through that if you want to.
We have primary sources even in the pyramids. We have the inscriptions, the worker gang of Khufu. And that's so like that's right there. We have Khufu's name.
Just side note, look at the language of ancient Egyptian and you compare that with ancient Greek that we know exists. Not at the time, I'm saying look at the language barrier we have to interpret these glyphs and all these words in ancient Egyptian. HWFW, SMRWPR. Okay? This is the level of language at the time this is being written, supposedly.
On the blocks that are on the pyramid, as you pointed out, at the very least, we have he's involved with the pyramid. He's right. His name's on it.
Well, at the very least, I mean, this could be fake. This could be from Weiss's time.
That's Howard Weiss's team that found that. That's been disregarded by many of the alternate historians. Howard Weiss's team's also found the iron plate in the Great Pyramid.
Which is interesting to note that Weiss, so on two sides of the coin, on one side the Egyptologists are saying, it can't be metal from that because it doesn't fit with the time period and our narrative we want to go with. And on the other side, the alternate researchers are saying it's probably Weiss who forged it because, as I just showed you, the King's Chamber has no inscriptions or paintings in it whatsoever. That is not the characteristics of an ancient Egyptian pharaonic tomb. It would be wall to wall in writing, in hieroglyphs, in imagery, in color, and it doesn't have any of that. It's just granite, red granite. That's it. Not a characteristic of a tomb of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh.
Which is basically discounted by most of the mainstream. Oh, there's no way, because it's not meteoric iron. This is smelted iron.
So here's a bit of the evidence that it's smelted iron. You can go through that and pause that and have a look if you want.
And they found that in the Great Pyramid. So it's one of the funniest things about this whole thing is that both sides are like, Howard Weiss's team was just looking for something to encourage their funding.
Now we're going to look at, this is the actual chamber from I think someone's done like a 3D scan of it. And this is on, I think, History Drops with Uncharted X, another Aussie researcher who does a lot of this work. He's been to Egypt so many times and he's got amazing videos on all of this stuff and stuff we're going to cover a bit later in the video about the copper tools and chisels and all this machine work that we're going to have a look at. But right here, he's going to talk about Weiss and the cartouche.
It's one of those chambers above the King's Chamber called relieving chambers. They're not relieving chambers. That thing's freestanding in there. It's quite impressive, really, what they achieved with that. I think the most likely scenario for that is that probably Howard Weiss probably did it. And I know Hancock and stuff, people say, well, it seems to curl under the stone. We don't know unless we peel it up and look. He could have been clever enough to paint it where it was, it looks like it goes under the stone, but we just don't know if it does go under the stone. So you may remember a story where there are a couple of German guys that got accused of defacing the pyramids and chased out of Egypt, and then Dryas pursued them to Germany, and they ended up being prosecuted in German courts, and lives were ruined over this.
So you look at the date here. So these two guys went in to go and they wanted to take a piece off of the red, I think it's ochre, to date it or chemically test it to see if they could determine a time period. But I don't know if you can, but they were trying to do it anyway, which would have been cool to see. What we see here, in April 2013, we see they were suspected of having illegally scraped samples of pigment off the chamber, which we're looking at right here. But the problem we have, and he's going to talk about, is this is Schock's photo in 2003, okay? So this is only just over a decade after he first did the Sphinx work. And then 2006, you can see there are marks out of the cartouche. And then you see in 2013, when these guys are accused of doing it, it's the same marks. So someone has done it before them, but these guys get chased out of Egypt by Zahi Hawass, as he's going to say, for apparently, allegedly doing it. But the problem is it's already been done in 2006 and we don't know who it was.
We're ruined over this. When it's sort of pristine, there's no evidence of sampling. Then there's another photo where a small section of the Shen ring has been taken. And this is prior to these German guys getting in there. And then they get in there, all this controversy happens, and we'll explain that in a minute. And then there's a photo of after, and that photo before and after, it's identical. It's the same, but the same little piece is missing. So somebody sampled it. Word got out about what they were doing, and Zahi made a massive international fuss. You can probably still find all the articles about it.
Zahi Hawass, again, he's implicated in everything that happens with Egyptology.
Sued them back to Germany. Eventually they were prosecuted for something in Germany. Like, their lives were really ruined. Somebody sampled it. Who was that? Was it the ministry? Weiss was running out of money. His excavations at the time, he was running out of steam. He'd been in those chambers for a while, which is like, why didn't you discover this before? But one of his funders were coming over and he needed a discovery. And it just so happened that just before this person came over, he's like, oh, I've made this discovery, found this Khufu glyph. We've got evidence that he built the pyramid.
Very convenient for Weiss, isn't it? That he'd been there for a while, and you got to say he would have known that this was there if he'd had all this time in the pyramid and he'd been in that area. Why did he only find it right when one of his donors is going to come in, just before he's about to be shut down? Because if he hasn't found anything significant, well, you lose your funding. Very convenient for him, isn't it, that he found it right when he needed to. These are the details that kind of make you go, bit skeptical.
Got evidence that he built the pyramid, and it worked. He got more funding and he could continue his work. So it seems to me possible that he might have painted that in there.
Now, as I said before, if the evidence we've seen proves that Khufu's pyramid was built, or the Great Pyramid was built over centuries, it looks like, then these are the mathematical equations for building Khufu's pyramid in his reign. 25 years is what they credit it being. Listen to this.
Even the Great Pyramid, okay, 6 million tons, 2.5 million blocks, whatever. One block every 5 minutes if you do it over 25 years.
What?
One block every 5 minutes.
Every 5 minutes for 25 years. That's the mathematical numbers we're looking at. Are you serious? This is why it seems more likely, based on the evidence, that it's been built over generations, over centuries, based on all the evidence I've shown you here, based on this mathematical evidence, based on more evidence we're going to see with the ability or inability to cut stone, granite, at the rate that they would need to build it in the time frame that the Egyptological narrative gives us.
If you do it over 25 years, that's like maybe half of the work that's involved in the whole thing. Like, you've got planning, you've got bedrock preparation, you've got causeways, you've got structures, you got the basalt pavement, you got the valley temple, you've got the pyramid temple.
Yeah.
So much stuff. And planning just that's going to take years. I'm pretty skeptical that these things were done in the lifetime of a king, or the Grand Egyptian Museum has taken longer to build than supposedly the pyramids did.
The Grand Egyptian Museum is now operational and open to the public. Like, come on, if our modern engineering can't build a museum in the time it took to build, come on.
So Khufu was claiming it, right? I mean, there's no doubt that either whether he built it or not, he was at that point in time, he's claiming this.
Yes.
We know that pharaohs have done this on monuments that aren't theirs. So it stands to reason that Khufu would have done this too. But here's the information and evidence we have of primary sources that Gnostic wants to say, even though the 26th dynasty is nearly 2,000 years after the reign of Khufu. And Dan brings up a really good point on that.
That's undisputable.
Undisputed. Yeah.
And even this next dynasty, the 6th dynasty, is saying he built the pyramids. Mm-hmm. So that's at the very least, right then and there, people are saying Khufu built the pyramid. I had that in here too.
Okay.
So this is the inventory stuff. This is later. This is 26th dynasty.
I don't think you can take that and say they built the whole pyramid.
Yeah.
I think they worked on it. Yeah. And we know they renovated and worked on lots of stuff. Stele of Khufu's daughter, the inventory stele, talks about Khufu repairing the Sphinx.
But they say it's just priests made it up
It's like they don't like the evidence, so they just dismiss it.
But I'm showing you, it's a primary source. It says he, Khufu, built this pyramid next to the temple goddess Isis, a temple of the goddess Isis, and he built the pyramid for his. Now this is later,
much later,
but I'm just showing you primary sources.
Well, you can't really call that primary source. But
what else would be?
I mean, if I wrote something down now that says Jesus died on the cross, is that a primary source? I'm less than 2,600 years away.
Well, it's not a primary. It's not a eyewitness account.
Neither is
that. It's a primary source though.
Is this
because we didn't understand hieroglyphics until after the time of Napoleon.
That doesn't make it a primary source. See how he's moving the goalpost again? Just because we didn't know until Napoleon makes the 26th dynasty a primary source for Khufu, who was nearly 2,000 years earlier.
You're right. You're very right to point out that it's not a contemporary source. But it's still a primary source.
This could be a comic book.
What is the definition of a primary source? Let's just get this out the way. It is an original, first-hand account or raw piece of evidence about an event, time period, or topic. These sources are created by someone directly involved 2,000 years later, present 2,000 years later, or experiencing it firsthand 2,000 years later, and they provide uninterpreted, direct access to the subject, well, that is not a primary source. I think he's conflating his ideas of primary sources in ancient Greek texts. Well, he likes to say, I'm citing primary sources from ancient Greek texts, but in this case, it's 2,000 years after it happened. Primary source is what I did with my video on Cleopatra, because I cited Strabo, who was around the same time as Cleopatra, writing about her death. That's an example of citing a primary source. Citing a 26th dynasty saying Khufu built the pyramids when they're nearly 2,000 years after Khufu lived is not a primary source. And just because we didn't know hieroglyphs until Napoleon had them deciphered, through ancient Greek, by the way, doesn't mean it's a primary source
of what happened in those days. For all we know, this is...
All right, but it's still, the Egyptians, I'm saying the Egyptians themselves all understood this was Khufu's pyramid.
And like what we saw before, usually texts lie. According to the person, Luke Gorton, the classicist that you said was destroying in a debate, but he said most texts lie. So how do we know that the 26th dynasty 2,000 years later isn't lying, according to your guy Luke?
If I go to Italy right now and I start asking them about the building of the Colosseum, what can I expect these people to know?
Exactly fucking right. That's what we're talking about, a perfect analogy. If you go to Italy right now, ask them about the building of the Colosseum 2,000 years ago, what? Is that a primary source? Because that's literally what we're talking about. Just because it's so far ago, people think, oh, ancient Egypt, that means everything they wrote was at the same time. And no, it's a period of thousands of years. It's so long.
Fucking thousands of years ago. I mean, no offense.
No, I'm just pointing out primary sources.
That's fair. I have a hard time calling that a primary source.
Is it 1,800 years later? Something like that?
Even later, 26th dynasty.
It's like over 1,000 at least. Oh yeah, at least. You can find the math on that. That's like saying, why aren't we building things the same way as people in the 1600s?
At the very beginning of...
It's 400 years is a long time.
So he was talking about building something like a cathedral in the 1600s compared to what we're building today. It's 400 years is a long time. See how he's moving the goalposts again? Because 2,000 years for him is a primary source for Khufu building the pyramids. But if we're talking about constructing 16th century or something in the 16th century compared to today, 400 years is a long time. But 2,000 years is good enough for a primary source for him. All right, now I'm going to bring up Bright Insight's video on ancient Egypt just to show you, because he brought up a lot of good stuff on like what it looks like in these tombs and some really other good information.
Most people have no idea that not one single mummy was ever found in any of the pyramids ever. There is literally zero ties that connect the so-called ancient Egyptians to the pyramids.
Now, this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of eidolon imagery we see in ancient Egyptian tombs. Does that look anything like the king's chamber of solid granite nothing like this? No, this is what it is like in an ancient Egyptian tomb for a pharaoh. Beautiful, colorful, hieroglyphs, everything to help them get to the afterlife. The gods are on the walls. Everything is there to help them pass through. And I've seen it firsthand when I went to see Ramses the Great's coffin, sarcophagus, and all his stuff. It's decorated to the max. There's so many inscriptions and paintings on his sarcophagus, the box, and there's no room for anything else. It's decorated wall to wall. The Great Pyramid and the King's Chamber has not one thing like that. And the only piece of evidence that we saw was a cartouche made by the workers in the underside of the relieving chamber. No. That is not evidence like we have here.
To the pyramids. Like I've said in other videos, out of the tens of thousands of hieroglyphs and petroglyphs found throughout ancient Egypt, not one single one of them shows anything about the pyramid.
Now that is very interesting. Not one of them shows anything about the Great Pyramids in Giza, which if they built them and they were responsible for everything about them, you would think, and they were the most important things to them, why isn't there more imagery of the pyramids? Why?
There is not one single hieroglyph or petroglyph inside the pyramids. Zero. Yet if you go to any known Egyptian tomb, they are covered wall to wall in art. Because after all, the Egyptians were known for being a Bronze Age culture, meaning that their most advanced technology was primitive, made of a combination of copper and tin, and the theory is that this is what they used to cut and carve these stone blocks.
So now we're going to move into the construction methods based on the mainstream narrative, the Egyptological narrative, and we're going to look at what they say, and we're going to look at all the mathematics that show the way they do it proves it is impossible to do it the way the Egyptological narrative has set out for us historically.
Jay Anderson is literally just saying they can't cut stone with copper because of the Mohs scale. Well, he's either doesn't understand the data or he's lying, because they could cut granite using arsenic copper with sand that has quartz in it. Quartz is a higher on the Mohs scale than granite, and we know they can do this because it's been done before. So what I'm saying, there's a difference between not knowing the data and just saying things, and then knowing the data and being, I disagree with it.
He said a lot of things there that I'm going to reuse because he's telling on himself right now.
And we know they can do this because it's been done before.
We know they can do this because it's been done before. We'll have a look at that.
So what I'm saying, there's a difference between not knowing the data and just saying things.
Not knowing the data and just saying things. Yeah, that's exactly what he's doing, and I'll show you.
I'm saying you're doing it right now, and what you're doing is fine.
Well, thanks. So
you love Jay Anderson, right? I mean, it's like a 10 out of 10 for you.
I think he's one of the most Dunning-Kruger people I've ever seen in my entire life.
This is one thing that Gnostic loves to bring up recently, like a lot. He talks about the Dunning-Kruger. You're Dunning-Kruger. I'm like, so what is it? It's a cognitive bias where people with limited knowledge or competence in a specific domain greatly overestimate their own abilities. It's kind of what he's been doing this whole video as I'm showing. Now here's a video of Jay Anderson in Egypt showing you some really anomalous granite cuts, okay? Now, quick side note, I saw this on X or Twitter or whatever, and I didn't actually know it was Jay Anderson. I just saw this here and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Tube drills that look like they don't fit the mainstream Egyptological narrative. And then when I found out it was Jay Anderson and they just quoted him, I laughed a lot.
So for size comparison, we see these types of channels all over the Giza Plateau. Look at the size of this one, which you could easily stick a modern PVC pipe into this,
right?
And it would be the ideal dimensions for fluid distribution.
I'm not going to say that's exactly what happened. He's saying that in modern times, it looks like you could fit a PVC pipe in there. And what do we use PVC pipes for? For fluid distribution, which is interesting. Did they use it for that? We don't know. They'd have to chemically test that, and I don't think there's any chemicals left on that to be able to test. But look at the one behind it. There's a circular hole, like there's a hole in granite. Now you're telling me that they did that with copper chisels or copper saws? No freaking way.
This has a nice little core tubular drill here. What were these components of originally? Because they're just strewn about and we have no idea where this would have fit. Where the hell did these things go originally?
Right.
And we'll never know.
The 100% we'll never know because we don't know what they were used for. It's granite. Look at these cuts. Like there's no way the mainstream idea can make this. No way. Now, this is one of the most famous offcuts in Egyptian museum history. Now you can see this line at the back looks like a marking where they want to line up the cut. Now you can see the line is going off curve, way off to the curve. Look at this. It's facing this way down here instead of going straight on the line that they've set out for it. So it's interesting that they've already set a line out for it, but you can see the line is facing well off that center line. And this does not happen if you are cutting at the rate that we will see they cut granite with the saws that they are cutting with. Spoilers, he says they cut about this much in a few days. If you're cutting this much granite in over a few days of work, how then are you going to cut that far off in that long amount of time? There is no way. You would have to be cutting super fast to be cutting off that much of the line. Because if you're cutting so slow and you realize you're already off cut, you'd stop immediately and go backwards. There's no way you're going to cut half a day. Like if you're cutting this much, this is probably, honestly, if you are cutting this much, this is probably based on the Egyptologists and what they did, I would say at least 4 days work, at least maybe 5, based on what they were cutting on. So there's no way you're going to have nearly a week of overcut. There's no way. No fucking way.
It is worth mentioning that, you know, it is, this was hours of an offcut. According to this method, it probably would have took half a day in order to make that offcut.
They say half a day. According to this method, okay, which is what we're talking about in here, but this method I'm going to show you has so many flaws, and what they actually showed is nowhere near the ability that what this claims. Now, this is from a paper written in the 90s that severely overestimates the ability of what they could do
in order to make that offcut.
I think they would have stations of this going on.
I think they would have. This is just making it up. This is assumptions now.
One at a time. So there is a few scholars who think that they added emery that they would have traded with the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, which is an emerald almost as strong as diamond.
Yeah.
That's a put a pin in that. That's another issue for another video. If the Mycenaeans were trading with the Egyptians, they would have known the stories about Egypt and the Jews in Egypt around the time of the Bible that is supposed to be written. That's another issue. Because if Mycenaean Greeks are traveling to Egypt, they would know the stories that are going on, which is why we have an issue. There's no Greek text, no nothing that says anything about Israel or these people in Egypt at the time. Okay? No Greek text until the 3rd century BC in their own Jewish text in the Septuagint.
Traded with the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, which is an emerald almost as strong as diamond, mixing it with the sand that has quartz in it, which would make it cut faster. Like, what's the evidence?
But now this is where I want to point out, we have no evidence for this emery.
Flinders Petrie, in one of his writings, says he saw there was like remnants of green rock on one of the copper saws.
This is what we're off.
Sure.
He said kind of land.
Sure.
We don't.
You're right. Okay, fair enough. Let's go to the next one. That might not be true. An example of how this was cut. They had rocks to weigh it down. There's another one. That's the tube saw.
Do you notice this picture that he's using as evidence for Egyptians using copper tools to cut granite? Do you see any granite in this picture? All right, let's go to another clip from Bright Insight.
The tube saw.
Here's a picture of one of the best preserved bronze saws from the time of the ancient Egyptians. The blade is less than 2 feet in length, and again made of bronze. The only depictions of the Egyptians using bronze saws at all were on wood.
The only evidence that we have of them using these type of saws, you can clearly see it in the top one where the arrow is on wood. No evidence of them using it on granite.
And this is what a gigantic 4th dynasty drag saw. Huge. And it had the mechanisms to keep it straight. And you would have 3 people on each side and you see the guy pouring the sand.
The problem is, this is all hypothetical.
With the quartz in it. Like, what's the evidence?
Where's this glyph? Is this a glyph?
This is out of a textbook.
Yeah.
This is showing you.
This is based on what we've recovered and how we know, like we've recovered.
This is a hypothesis. There's one hieroglyph that shows a drag saw. It's got one guy on each side. It's got one dude in the middle pouring water. It's considerably smaller than this. You have to wonder how long a foreman would walk off site in order to get the offcuts like you see in the Siriprium or whatever the hell, that one coffin lid that's just all goofy wonky you always see.
The last several years, mainstream Egyptologists have actually finally tested these proposed methods and ultimately were completely debunked. They didn't even finish one single block, guys.
And that's what I'm talking about. I'll show you the video of it later with Uncharted X video. But this is what he's saying. He cut about, this much? Over multiple days of working on this with a copper saw. Days of work. And you're telling me that the 25 years took to build the pyramid when you would have had to cut, place a stone every 5 minutes? Because there's 2.5 million stones? There's no way. There's no way.
These marks, replete with striations, are the result of some form of sawing or grinding. It's here that mainstream archaeology gets itself into something of a pickle, as these marks, found not only on the basalt blocks of the pavement, but as Petrie described also on the boxes or sarcophagi in the pyramids and on large granite slabs, have to be explained by other methods.
Just look, I don't know if you can see, but I can see this. Look at the striations. This is the box in the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber. All right, this is the sarcophagus in the King's Chamber. Look at the striations in this. What kind of tool makes these kind of indents, line by line, in a piece of granite? And it looks like it's flecked it off, like a little speck of granite is flicked off. Like, what kind of tool can just hack into granite like that? It's not copper, as we just saw. Now, this is where Uncharted X is going to go into the paper. I would have loved to see these guys go into the details and just look at Gnostic and go, hey, look at this. This is what the paper you're citing actually says.
An attempt at explaining them was made by Robert G. Moores Jr. in an article titled Evidence for Use of a Stone-Cutting Drag Saw by the 4th Dynasty Egyptians, published in 1991 in the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt. With Moore's proposed solution of this drag saw, he had no alternative but to state that, quote, the degree of mechanization indicated by this operation is somewhat more advanced than general views of the pyramid builders' technology level.
Come on! Even in the paper that Gnostic cites, the guy says the degree of mechanization is somewhat more advanced than general views of the pyramid builders' technology level now hold. They're just attributing them with more advanced capabilities with these primitive methods than what we know that they were able to do, based on no evidence. See, this is why I put this clip in.
They think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
Yeah, I think I do. I do think that's happening, based on your own evidence that you are citing in this debate.
The sawing done in this place represents a sophisticated operation of a mature industry.
So it was an industrial scale level, is what they're saying this granite cutting was. People have been saying that for a long time. It looks like industrial scale granite cutting. And it's not just the saws, as we'll see later on. There are tube holes, which we saw a little bit of, but there, oh my God, just wait till you see this stuff. Now, this is from Christopher Dunn. He's an engineer, and he's saying what this figure is showing to him, and he's explaining it.
We see in the figure a team of workers dragged a blade across a block that was fixed inside a trench filled with water. The blade was suspended on ropes that were controlled by workers who, according to Moores, managed the blade's incremental descent into the basalt. Just with this description of the blade and the image of its theoretical operation, you can begin to imagine some of the practical mechanical problems with this proposed solution. And this is only the beginning of the issues with the mainstream explanation. It is hard to imagine the successful employment of the physics of a pendulum on a swinging 308-pound object that ultimately is met with a hard, solid surface covered in sand. If we take into consideration the fact that the blade is wedge-shaped, which would mean its increasing width would impede its progress into the slot, the impossibility of the operation becomes more evident.
Exactly, because look, if you got a saw that size, and you're supposed to be cutting it into a block that is making corners and edges like this, it's just not going to work. Look, there's a little hole in there too. Like, there is no way, I'm saying it right now, there is no way, based on the mainstream narrative, that they did this with the copper tools that they claimed they did it with. And we don't even have any evidence of this tool here that they're claiming they used.
Where it gets truly ridiculous is with Moore's claimed rate of cutting with such a setup. A single cycle of this saw, one back and forth motion, would cut 2 millimeters into the basalt. And with a swing time of around 2.84 seconds, it would cut at a rate of 42 millimeters per minute.
Based on what? Based on an assumption, as we'll see, because the numbers that we actually get in modern machining with diamond-tipped saws, it's...
As explained by Chris Dunn, United States patent number 7082939, filed in 2003, describes an improved frame saw using carbon alloy steel blades impregnated with diamonds, and cites a downfeed rate into granite of 30 millimeters not per minute, but per hour. This modern rate of granite cutting using powered saws with diamond-tipped blades is 84 times less than the rate cited by Moore with his copper drag saw using sand and human power.
Either doesn't understand the data or he's lying.
Gnostic, you either don't understand the data or you're lying, because there is no way that a saw like this, dragged back and forth, is cutting 84 times faster than this kind of saw that we have right now. Industrial scale saws that we have. There is no way. No way. The numbers just don't lie. And we saw that in that picture where he said we cut this much in a few days with copper. It's just ridiculous. How are Egyptologists getting away with this? Every engineer should be saying, this is bullshit. There is no way this is happening. The Egyptologist, you know why? Because Zahir Was is the head of Egyptology. So he's the one that's always on the forefront pushing all this stuff. And he's so arrogant. He doesn't want to concede a damn thing, because if he does, his whole house of cards goes. And we've got to rewrite history, because The numbers don't lie. The mathematics doesn't lie. And you've got people here, like this guy, sitting there either not understanding the data that's right in front of him that he's citing himself, or he's lying, which I've shown that he's done before.
Also comparing the modern rate of cutting into granite, while Moore is citing a rate of cutting into basalt, which is harder and therefore even more difficult to cut than granite.
Their numbers are even worse for him because that's citing basalt, where our modern stuff is citing granite. The debate is over. The numbers just don't lie. This is ridiculous. Beyond ridiculous now.
They think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
Well, you're blind. Willfully blind at this point if all the evidence doesn't show you, hey, they couldn't cut like this. And this isn't me. This is maths. And this is the Egyptologists themselves that couldn't do this shit. As you will see right here in this next clip.
Experimental archaeologist Dennis Stocks has experimented with human-powered copper saws using sand to grind through granite. In 1999, Stocks tested a much smaller setup of this drag saw. These were the observations and results from Dennis Stocks' test. His results varied between 0.105 and 0.084 inches per hour into the granite, a far cry from Moore's 42 millimeters per minute, and some 14 times less than the rate quoted by our modern diamond-tipped frame saw example. Also worthy of note here is that the copper of the blade is ground away by the sand, just like the granite, and Stocks reported losing nearly 0.5 kilogram of copper from his blade over 14 hours of use.
This is crazy. Look at these numbers right here in number 4. Okay, number 3, this is the one we're just looking at. His rate of cutting, 2.1 to 2.7 millimeters per hour. A US patent, which what we saw, the frame saw, 30 millimeters per hour. That's a giant modern saws. And the drag saw claimed 42 millimeters per minute. Absolute pulling it out of thin air, making it up so the Egyptians seemed like they were so much more advanced than what they were with copper tools, because they have no idea how they cut this granite at the rate they did. No idea, because we haven't found the tools. But just because we haven't found the tools doesn't mean that they didn't use insane tools to cut all this stuff. Because we have evidence of it, we'll see in future clips. And look at how much copper you're going to need to go through all this stuff. You're losing 500 grams every 14 hours. And if you're cutting over days and days, which is what he says, you're going to need a lot of copper.
Chris Dunn estimated how long it might have taken to simply rough out the granite box that is found inside the middle pyramid. This is purely making the 6 basic cuts to shape the box, the top and bottom, and the north, south, east, and west faces. It would have taken some 6,270 hours of grinding with a copper bar to make these cuts.
And we know they can do this because it's been done before.
Like, I don't know what he's citing. We know they can do this because it's been done before. And what they did before is exactly what I'm going to show you right now.
As you can see here, we achieved this in just a few days.
We achieved this in just a few days. He says it right there. As if it's some sort of achievement, an accomplishment, when you're trying to sell us that the Great Pyramid was cut, quarried, and built in 25 years. With 2.5 million stone blocks.
Even the Great Pyramid, okay, 6 million tons, 2.5 million blocks, whatever. 1 block every 5 minutes if you do it over 25 years.
We achieved this in just a few days.
261 days of 24 hours a day, non-stop work, just to get the basic shape of the box completed.
Well, he's either doesn't understand the data or he's lying.
Blocks alone aren't even close to all there is when it comes to granite either. The obelisks, the 400, 800 and 1,000-ton statues, as well as the many single-piece stone boxes, not the least of which are the 24 huge and enigmatic boxes of the Serapeum at Saqqara. Try to imagine the rough shaping of a Serapeum box, some of which are more than 15 feet long. How long would it take to make this long axis cut on one of these boxes? Where do they get the copper for all of this theoretical grinding? I all too often get the question of where are the tools when discussing the evidence for ancient machining. This question could also be applied to the mainstream explanation. No copper saws of the type described by Moores have ever been found.
So why is it that Egyptologists are allowed to get away with making up shit like this without any evidence of having the tools that they claim were able to do the job at the rate that it's happening? It's all okay when it's hypothetical and written in papers, but when they do it in person, actually on granite, it's this much in a few days. Doesn't that just completely disprove the whole Egyptological narrative? We're done. If in any other field this happened and you were proved so wrong, so badly, you would be thrown out. Why do we allow Egyptologists to keep getting away with this? Ridiculous.
And neither have the smaller type of drag saw that was used by Dennis Stocks in order to make his 2 to 3 feet long cuts in his experiment.
Now this is on Danny Jones with Uncharted X again. Now you can clearly see, look, this is a saw cut. It's an overcut as well. You can clearly see right here, there's a small cut here and they've gone back and reset the cut and gone back. If anyone's done any work with saws, which I have in wood, this is talking about, I've talked in a wood setting and context where I've been on machines with cutting with saws. This is exactly what it looks like, but we're talking about super hard granite. What kind of saws would you have to cut granite like this at the rate they were doing it? I wish we had some form of tool. I wish we did, but we don't. But the evidence is in the details on the stone that we do have.
Experiment. So this is at Karnak. This is in an obelisk, and you literally have circular saw overcuts. You can literally see on this one here where it was exactly what you were talking about. Like,
oh yeah, you see right there, yeah.
On this right one here, it's the tiny line here. That is an overcut that's offline, so they brought it back and started again on the actual correct line. Now this is kind of like the cut that we saw, but it went way deeper in the giant granite box that we saw before. But this proves that they're doing some super high velocity cut because they stopped it and then went back. If you were going so super slow, you would have stopped it here. You know you're offline, you stop it here. The fact that there was such a giant mess up with that granite box in that offcut tells me that they were able to use granite to whatever use they wanted it to be. It wasn't like what we use it today, where it's super hard to cut. So they were okay with just leaving offcuts on the ground, like as if it's a piece of wood like we use today. Oh, it was an offcut of wood, just throw it away. That's how they treated granite. Like, what kind of technology do they have? They could use granite at a rate that we use wood and just discard it like it's nothing when we stuff up the cut. It shows that they were able to use granite at a rate that we cannot even conceive today.
The profile fits a big circular saw.
They think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
When people suggest that a civilization dated thousands of years prior to the Egyptians, well, they say, well, that's just not possible. But then they chose to ignore that the Egyptians did leave behind detailed lineage of the pharaohs dating back more than 30,000 years.
They just say it's all mythological after a certain point in history. They say, oh, these are the gods of ancient Egypt, so they just count it as mythological. They don't really count it as history up until you started the first dynasty. And it's like, oh, well, these ones were real, but the ones before that were just mythological. It's like, why? Based on what? Based on your assertion, Egyptologist?
Much like in the case of the tilted photograph of Petrie's famous drill core number 7, they seem to be willing to go to any length in order to deny it. I think this is because the implications of such evidence threaten the very foundations of the story of human civilization on this planet as we know it. Yeah, that's Petrie's core number 7 there. So he determined that this spiral groove that's on the stone has a 1 in 60 penetration rate, right? For every 60 inches of horizontal travel, you're getting an inch of vertical travel. And then when you compare that to our modern tools, it essentially rounds out to being about 500 times greater penetration rate into stone than we can achieve.
Okay, the numbers don't lie. It was refined a little bit, so it's not exactly 1 in 60. I think it's just a bit under, but just go round number, 1 in 60. 500 times greater than what we can achieve today with our technology of cutting into granite. Now, it doesn't mean it was super fast, but it means it was able to cut into the granite 500 times faster than what we could do. Like, what technology did they have that would be able to cut 500 times quicker than what we can? It's not copper fucking chisels and saws. You can clearly see the striations in this whole thing, the way it's been cut. The striations the whole way down, pretty uniformly as well. So it's some mechanism that's twisting. Wow.
The holes that they come out of are straight and it's tapered. So it tells us that the tool itself was probably tapered.
Now you explain this to me with copper tools and chisels. Look at this. This is an indent in granite, okay? So it looks like, based on what I've done with wood, it looks like a jig or some set frame that is indenting into the granite that is set there, and then the machine does its job. This is like softening the granite to a point that just sets into it, so then the tool can do its work. That's what that looks like. Looks like there's one here, a line here, and a line here, and then cuts that core out. And look at how rough this is here, and how rough on the outside. Look how smooth it is on the inside. There's no way you can explain this with normal Egyptological methods. No way.
At each top and bottom of the inset edge that is around the box, it has large diameter tube drill holes. Clearly, whoever manufactured this box had a solution for this particular problem.
The problem is, how do you get those holes into those corners? What tool do you use to do this? How do you do that with the tools that they're telling us they used in ancient Egypt?
As the evidence for it sits here today for us all to see. The quarry and the unfinished obelisk that form the modern tourist attraction today have changed considerably from what they were only 100 years ago. Only a small portion of the obelisk was visible. The rest of the quarry was entirely buried under rubble and sand. And 1,168 metric tons.
1,168 tons. Now, remember back to the Roman era stuff. So if they had 1,000 or 1,100 tons, they would have needed 11 axles to lift this stone. But these guys cut out this with ease compared to what we just looked at with granite. And now this is ridiculous, that what they indoctrinate you in to watching a video of how they tell you that they did it. When you're looking at it for yourself, you can clearly see this is just propaganda, 100% pure propaganda from Egyptologists. And the most famous one, Zahi Hawass himself again.
Visiting the quarry in modern times begins with a mandatory indoctrination by way of watching a 15-minute DVD.
There you go, video, Zahi Hawass telling you, oh, this is how they did it, this is how it's been done forever, and don't use your brain.
Without it, the whole dolerite pounding stone thing would be so obviously ridiculous that you really need something official and authoritative like this in order to condition the average tourist's mind towards that explanation.
They think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
So this is Christopher Dunn, an engineer who had a discussion with an Egyptologist with the Department of Tourism in 2004. I was told that every time she accompanies engineers around the unfinished obelisk, they dismiss the official theory as unworkable. Engineers. See, it takes engineers to go, hey, this story is bullshit. And then they start discussing with themselves how it actually worked. But the mainstream narrative is
that it was pounding stones that made all of these scoop marks. It boils down to some very simple logic, as explained by Engelbach. They found dolerite or diorite pounders here, so therefore that's what must have made these marks. It's exactly the same logic that leads us to the copper chisel conclusion.
Now this is a better angle and image of what we saw before with that cut. Now look at this. This is clearly an inset of some device. And here, to sit in the rock with some frame to drill in. It kind of looks like a jig for cutting stone and cutting granite. Like when we use jigs for cutting wood. Today, this looks like a jig that you would put, or it could be the end of the tool that you're using that sets into the stone and then stays there while the tool does its job here. But definitely we've got something, so whatever mechanism it is sits into the stone, and it looks like it softens the stone and just sits in it. Like, we don't have anything that can do that today. We don't have copper tools. You can't do this. It's not possible with Egyptological narrative of using pounding stones of dolerite. Now he goes on to say, Christopher Dunn quoted Roger Hopkins is being tasked with carving out an obelisk using the tools that Egyptologists maintain the ancient Egyptians used. For quarrying, they theorized that dolerite pounders were used, okay? They were wielded by hand and bashed against the granite. And these balls are 5 to 12 inches in diameter and they weigh about 12 pounds. Now, this is what happened when they attempted to do it.
Hopkins has been at the task for 7 days when Lehner approaches him to view his progress. Lehner is not impressed, to say the least, for Hopkins had made very little headway, but proposed that he speed things up using more modern techniques. This is not the first time Hopkins has been involved with Lehner and has had to call in modern tools when running into difficulty with supposedly ancient methods. Nova's This Old Pyramid documentary had similarly run into difficulties using ancient techniques in the creation of a small pyramid. Lehner and Hopkins had to resort to steel tools and heavy machinery to lift most of the blocks that went into it.
So the Egyptologists themselves tried to set out to prove that it was dolerite pounders, and what happened? They couldn't do it. They had to resort to modern machinery that could lift heavy objects, because there's no way that this was happening with the methods that they were claiming the ancient Egyptians used.
They think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
As long as a few cubic centimeters of material are removed, that seems to be enough to declare victory. After 10 minutes, my wrists hurt from trying to guide the 12-pound rock in at an angle, the better to break the granite, and stabs of pain began shooting up my arms.
This is what he's quoting from this book. This is what people are experiencing when they are doing this dolerite pounding. They're getting so much pain from doing this. You think the ancient Egyptians were doing this? You've got to be mental to think this is how they did it. This says I did it for only 20 minutes, and all I had to show for it was a baby's palm full of granite dust, and the granite surface looked no different than when I'd started. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. The mainstream narrative of this. And this is Engelbach in the 20th century, early 20th century. He said he did it at a level about 5 millimeters, but he said the ancients could extract it by an assumption of 8 millimeters. See? More assumptions by the Egyptologists, or whatever, archaeologists, Egyptologists, assuming ancient Egyptians could do it at a rate more than what we can. And this is with dolerite pounders. So he severely overestimated, you'll see, his own abilities, or he overcalculated, we'll see, and then he overestimates the ancient Egyptians' abilities based on what? An assumption. An assumption, okay? This isn't science. And these are the rates of what they could extract by doing it with dolerite pounders. He claims it was 464.5 cubic centimeters per hour. That's rich. Then Mark Lehner, famous Egyptologist who mainstream to the max, 74.3, okay? And then Stocks, 30. Now, how much is that, as you'll see Uncharted X show you?
To give you an idea of how much material 30 cubic centimeters is, 2/5 the size of your average chicken egg, or around 3/4 the size of a golf ball. And then imagine it filled to the brim with golf balls. Then add 25% to that number. That's how many hours of non-stop pounding it might have taken just for the trenches.
The sheer weight of numbers in this just are ridiculous. To allow these people to push pseudoscience of dolerite pounders based on no evidence and assumptions onto us to say this is how it was done. It's bullshit. It's not science. It's propaganda. And it's happening in so many fields of study right now. Now, this next bit is so interesting, because if you look at these marks, and Uncharted X has it perfectly, it looks like a machine that is based on an arm that scoops out the material. What kind of material do you have that scoops out granite on an articulated arm? What the hell are they using?
This is a very common sign of an articulated tool that is working from a fixed spot. Consider something like a backhoe. If you're digging straight out, it leaves a straight line. But as you go left or right from the pivot point, the angle of the digging changes. I can't really explain this angle change that we can see here in the quarry as a result of the pounding stone hypothesis.
This is a better look at it. What? There is no way that this is explained by the modern standard Egyptological narrative of dolerite pounding stones. Look at it. It is pseudoscience, while claiming the people who are doing the actual science and studying and actual evidence, looking for the actual evidence and researching, Robert Schoch, are claiming they're fringe and pseudoscience. Now, I added this to show a better idea of Saxe-Wahmann, which we saw earlier in the video. Now, this is Uncharted X actually at the site. And look at this gigantic stone. Gigantic, absolutely ridiculous. And look at these tiny ones next to it. Look at this one on the edge. Look how big this is. You're telling me that Incas or whoever it was built this? There's no... Just stop. Just say we don't know. There's nothing wrong with saying we don't know how it was done, but we don't have to say it was Incas, because you look at the stonework right next to it. That's Inca stonework back here. That's filling a hole. This is something else.
Look, We believe in one God, creator of all things. These are PhDs. These are people who are doctors. And they have to sign this. So I understand why people, and I guess the point I'm making here at the end of this is like, yes, scholars are not perfect and they can get in cliques. They can be biased. There can be people who call themselves doctors and they think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. That can happen. And I've seen it with biblical studies. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
Well, I hope after everything I've shown so far, you do see it is an agenda in Egyptology to push a narrative that does not align with any evidence and data that even themselves have given to us.
Listen closely to exactly what Zahi said. So I guess my question for Zahi, I'd very much like to know is, what did you find inside that sarcophagus?
When I opened the sarcophagus, it was completely empty. Because Osiris is a myth, but there is no mummy. This is the first time I hear about a mummy found in this sarcophagus.
So we saw Zahi Hawass earlier with the Sphinx saying it's wind erosion, even though the person that he cited quoted it was water erosion. But he still keeps saying it's wind. So he knows he's lying. He's in public debates on Piers Morgan lying. He's on Joe Rogan lying. And he's saying here there was never any mummy found in the sarcophagus in the Osiris shaft. This is a Bright Insight video that just came out like a few days ago.
So you heard him very clearly articulate that the sarcophagus was completely empty, that the burial chamber was nothing more than symbolic, meaning that nothing was ever buried there in the first place. And he even went on to say that this was the first time that he was hearing of an alleged discovery of a mummy found inside the sarcophagus. That is exactly what I found to be the case following the interview when I read various published articles around the internet, all claiming that the sarcophagus was indeed found to be empty.
Snopes as well right here. But that's something I've found through my journalism studies and work, that a lot of places, they just go with one source, and then a lot of different outlets run with the same story without checking it. Clickbait journalism these days. So one source says something, and as soon as it happens, everyone else runs and publishes something because they want to be out as soon as possible. It's just what happens these days. People don't actually sit down and check and do the time like I'm doing here to put all this together to say, here's all the evidence. They just, oh, here you go. Here's one source, says this. Everyone's going to start posting stuff on it without checking it. This is how Zahi Hawass and all these people get away with this, because no one checks it. Good on Jimmy for doing this.
Even the prestigious Encyclopedia Britannica specifically annotates that the sarcophagus located on the third and lowest level was found perfectly preserved and empty, which led me to the Harvard University website, which had posted the publication on behalf of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, dated to 2007. Which Zahi Hawass himself is listed as an author.
The guy who's saying there was nothing found and who said before it's wind, when his own person quotes it's water, okay? He's the one that sided on this. What is he going to say? Back in 2007.
It describes something far, far different than what Zahi had said about finding it.
Completely empty.
Quote, the remains of a skeleton were discovered in the sarcophagus. I'm sorry, what? The publication very clearly articulates what was found on each individual level and very clearly describes that this is indeed the very sarcophagus in question, located on the third level down, even illustrating the tomb itself, its described measurements, and the detailing of skeletal remains as well as other various ancient Egyptian relics had indeed been discovered inside this very sarcophagus.
So we know he's a proven liar. He is quoted in here in 2007 on his own paper saying the remains of a skeleton were discovered in the sarcophagus. How come we keep letting these people who are proven liars run the world, control our history, control our governments, control everything? They're all proven liars, and we're still sitting here allowing them to do this to us.
Zahi Hawass himself has been previously implicated in illicit conduct, specifically in the facilitation of looting and sales of black market antiquities trade back in 2011.
They think they're doing science, but they're actually pushing some sort of agenda. That can happen. Now, I don't think that's happening in Egyptology. Maybe you do.
And it resulted in his ouster from the governmental position he had as the Supreme Minister of Antiquities for Egypt. Countless amounts of ancient Egyptian artifacts have been stolen and sold on the illegal antiquities market for many decades. 2011 estimate claimed that the black market for ancient Egyptian mummies and other artifacts $2 to $6 billion per year.
$2 to $6 billion. Look, selling antiquities to make money. This guy's been kicking the can down the road for so long because he doesn't want anything to be found that's gonna overthrow the narrative that, hey, the pyramids are blah, 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 whatever date that we've had a look in now. Because this was found, it published in 2017, but as Jimmy says, found 2016, they discovered it. So it's 10 years ago. This is a decade ago. And I remember when this came out, you got the scanned pyramids, big void. They found a void. So it looks kind of like the same shape as the Grand Gallery. So it could be another gallery above the King's Chamber. There could be another chamber up here, but we don't know because they haven't done anything for 10 fucking years. Now they say they're going to go in this year and November's going to be huge and it's going to rewrite history. I think they said that it was going to rewrite Egyptology or whatever. But until then, it's been 10 years, okay? We've been sitting here saying, go search it, go search it, go search it. And they've done nothing for 10 years, okay? This is why. They just sit on their hands when all of us have been saying, go look in this pyramid. If you found evidence of something, go look for it. No, because it's much easier and more beneficial for them to sit and do nothing and keep the status quo so they can keep making money on the side by selling illegal antiquities. After being accused of wasting public money and exposing Egyptian antiquities to possible theft, okay? This is all alleged. This is what he's done, okay? Shipping them overseas without permission. There's a missing mummy that he wrote about in 2007 that he claims was never there, but it could bring in a lot of money for him if he were to sell it on an illegal market.
I think the responsible thing to do if you're not an expert is to appeal to people who are experts.
Yeah, those same experts that have been doing nothing for the last 10 years while we're waiting for more evidence to come out of stuff that could prove them wrong. Why would they want anything to come out when it could prove them wrong? They wouldn't want that. That's why they've been sitting on it for 10 years. All right, that's Egypt done. Now, the last section is going to be on the Younger Dryas because we did touch on it a little bit, but I'm just going to show you the quotes and I'm going to show you the evidence. That's it. Let's go.
What could have caused the extinction of all of these huge creatures, and what could have caused the dramatic sea level rise and the temperature change, if not some type of a cataclysm? Or
well, like I said, my understanding is from the science is actually it works pretty well just with natural climate change. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and act like an expert in this field at all, but like I said, I have to appeal to the people that actually study this stuff their entire lives because I really can't get to it that way.
So appeal to the experts and people who study this their whole lives. Okay, well, we're going to look at some scientific studies. So let's see if you change your mind on this after reading science. Okay, scientific studies from experts.
The theory is that there was a comet that hit the Earth and it caused the Younger Dryas, period. Like, what's the evidence?
Thank you for asking what the evidence is again, Gnostic. Let's have a look. The NIH Scientific Journal says, premature rejection in science, the case of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And this is in January 2022. What does it say? Number 3, another great ice sheet comparable to the Laurentide had covered Finland, Norway, Sweden, and a part of Russia. As it retreated northward, the first catastrophic outburst flood from Baltic ice lake and freshwater body like Lake Agassiz formed from glacial meltwater occurred at the Younger Dryas onset 12.85 plus minus 0.69 thousand. 12,850 years ago is what we're talking about. Glacial meltwater at the onset of the Younger Dryas. The margins of the Greenland ice shelf began to destabilize at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, 12,800. Considering all of these events, Kennett noted that it is difficult to explain the triggering of such widespread synchronous changes at the margins of 3 relatively isolated northern hemisphere ice sheets, Laurentide, Fennoscandian, and Greenland, and their related proglacial lakes by invoking conventional climatic and or paleo-oceanographic processes. Instead, this broad range of evidence is more readily explained by catastrophic processes triggered by a cosmic impact with Earth, the Younger Dryas boundary cosmic impact theory. Scientific paper saying it's difficult to explain the triggering changes in isolated ice sheets. So what else did they find? Iridium has since been found at dozens of other KPG boundary sites. It belongs to the platinum group elements, which also include osmium, palladium, platinum, rhodium, and ruthenium. Microspherules with size in range of a few tens of microns occur at the boundary and at many known impact sites and represent another accepted marker. Okay, so they're finding these markers of these things that can't really be explained by normal natural processes. Nano-sized diamonds have been found at the boundary in Alberta, an impact crater in Germany, and at another impact crater in Siberia. Nanodiamonds thus provide another impact marker. The most direct and diagnostic indicators of an ET event, extraterrestrial event, are minerals like quartz and zircon that have been shocked at the extreme pressures that in nature only impact can produce. So these are the pieces of evidence that are saying, hey, it looks like it was an extraterrestrial impact in multiple areas of the planet, because you're looking at things that do not occur naturally on Earth, like platinum and iridium. So that's what the evidence is we're finding of extraterrestrial cosmic impact. Now I'm going to show you a clip from Ancient Apocalypse, which is just going to look at the actual layer in the Earth.
In an area of exposed Earth that contains what's known as a black mat.
Represents the extinction layer. Below that, there are mammoth bones, there are American horse bones, American camel, the direwolves, and saber-toothed cats. And so far, not a single one of those has been found in place above that layer.
But what's the evidence?
Thank you for asking again, Gnostic. So what is the evidence? So this is on the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, you know, the scientific evidence you want to use and quote. Okay, I'm doing that. So this is talk about Younger Dryas black mats and a termination of that in North America. The megafaunal extinction and the Clovis Folsom transition appear to have occurred in less than 100 years, perhaps much less, and are defined stratigraphically by the Z1-2 contact. This contact and the initiation of Younger Dryas black mat deposition appear not to have been time transgressive. This implies that the extinction of the Rancho La Brea megafauna was geologically instantaneous, essentially catastrophic. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Essentially catastrophic.
We think that probably 50 to 60% of the people across the northern hemisphere died at this time.
When the black mat was first discovered and analysed in the 1960s, scientists carbon dated it to around 12,800 years ago.
This is proving this isn't some fringe theory, because in the 60s they dated it to the time period of the Younger Dryas that we're talking about.
What we found is melted glass spherules. So this is our first clue that some high temperature event had happened. Well, there was a peak in platinum and in iridium. There's only one thing on Earth that can do that, and that's some kind of cosmic impact.
Now this right here is from the show still, and it's showing you the Younger Dryas boundary field. So we're seeing a lot of these sites that have these markers for what happened at the end of the last ice age with these potential extraterrestrial incursions. Now we can see there's a bunch in North America, one in Mexico, there's a few in Europe, and there's one in Syria.
My understanding is we've never found a comet of that size. If it did hit, it would have had to hit a glacier, and the glacier would have to melt.
But if there was a comet strike, where's the impact crater? If the primary impacts at the beginning of the Younger Dryas were on ice caps, when the ice melts away, there's no crater left to see.
Thank you very much. Like, yeah, if you got a mile thick of ice and you have comets raining into it, or a giant comet or a bunch of comets, it's going to melt instantaneously and there's going to be no trace left of an impact crater at all. But we do have the Carolina Bays, which Matt Beall did bring up, which could point to a bunch of smaller meteorites in around that southeastern US area, which does look like it could be from impacts.
The science works without a glacier. There's enough evidence for natural climate change. Like, what's the evidence? Another thing that kind of throws me off with this is, let me ask you, why do you think it's called Younger Dryas?
The Scandinavian scientists at the turn of the 19th century named the cool period the Younger Dryas in honor of Dryas octopetala, a plant of the Arctic tundra that flourished under the return of near glacial temperatures. Scientists use the term younger to distinguish it from the older Dryas, an earlier time in which the plant had also flourished. The last major glacial period had experienced some 25 short-term climate alternations, but the Younger Dryas cool episode differed from them not only in timing but also in behavior. The Younger Dryas is different from the 25 short-term climate alternations to the older Dryas.
There's an older Dryas right before this period, from 18,000 BC to 14,000 BC. So was there another comet then? Because it's actually, that period is actually almost worse than the Younger Dryas.
Well, here's what it actually says. One such difference was that although the Pleistocene temperature oscillations were geologically rapid, yes, the onset of the termination of the Younger Dryas were even more abrupt. Quote, within a single year or less. Because geologically, this happens over usually thousands of years, this rise and fall in temperature and oscillation, all right? But this says the Younger Dryas within a year or less. How could that happen with natural climate change? The temperature of central Greenland fell by 9 to 14 degrees Celsius. Then, quote, in less than a few decades, and possibly in less than a few years, end quote, temperatures rose by 5 to 10 degrees. So you have a massive plummeting, 9 to 14 degrees Celsius. That's freezing cold. If your natural is like normal at Greenland is maybe just say 20 degrees and you're dropping to an average of 10 on less, man, that's a completely different climate within a single year. That is extravagant compared to all the other epochs before it that we're talking about, which is set in the last 25 oscillations. This is unprecedented.
So we're talking from the whole 18,000 BC or before present all the way to 10,000 before present. That whole period basically was a cooling period in general.
Let's take another look at that journal, which says the last great northern hemisphere ice sheet began to grow at 115,000 years ago. At the end of the last interglacial, and by 26,500 years ago, had reached its maximum size and extent. So you've got a giant ice sheet 26,500 years ago at its maximum. Then 20,000 years ago, it took 6,500 years, increasing solar insolation due to changes in the Earth's orientation and position in space, normal cycles, caused the great ice sheets to begin to melt and recede. This is the beginning of the melting based on normal cycles of the Earth. So it took 6,500 years to begin to melt. It was warming the whole time, and then from 20,000 to 12,850, it's warming and it's melting, it's heating up. And at 12,850, the warming ended and the temperature suddenly plummeted back to near glacial frigidity, where it remained for 1,200 years until the warming resumed. The ice sheet's at its maximum, it begins to recede, it continues to recede, and because it's getting warmer and warmer over time, over thousands and thousands of years, about 7,000 years of warming, and then boom, freezing cold again for 1,200 years. And then it started warming.
That whole period basically was a cooling period in general.
No, that's not what the data says. That is not what the data says. It was warming and then went to a deep freeze again for 1,200 years. 12,800, and this says 12,850, to about 11,600 years ago. And then it started warming again. Okay, so there's something's going on that is outside the norm of natural Earth cycles.
To me, it debunks the idea that this comet hit right when Plato or right when Göbekli Tepe was, because we're talking, this had to have happened before the older Dryas.
He doesn't know the data. Either, I'll quote himself, either he doesn't know the data or he's lying. And I just think he doesn't understand or know the data. I don't think he's read it. I think he's just listened to the mainstream narrative talking points that blah, 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 Graham Hancock and all these people are wrong. And it's not true. The world is getting colder. It's like, that's not what the data says. So you haven't read it or you're misrepresenting it. The evidence debunks your whatever theories you're talking about right now that have no basis in the evidence and science.
Or right when Göbekli Tepe was, because we're talking, this had to have happened before the older Dryas, then the older Dryas makes no sense.
What he's saying makes no sense right now.
Well, he's either doesn't understand the data or he's lying.
Exactly. We're going to touch on Göbekli Tepe, but just because it's relating to what we're talking about right now with the Younger Dryas and the star alignments.
You've got snakes emanating from the body and the legs of the fox onto the other side of the pillar. And again, we have the snakes kind of emanating from these birds. We can interpret this as meteors radiating from specific constellations. At the time Göbekli Tepe was built, these were the constellations from which the Taurid meteor stream radiates from Aquarius and then from Pisces, and it makes that change over the course of a few weeks.
So now this is pillar 43 on the left, and this is obviously they overlaid it with the stars that would be in the night sky that are representing what is on the pillar. Now you can see the Scorpio here fits not too bad. Now this one here they say is Sagittarius because it looks like what we would see as Sagittarius, but they've drawn it as like a vulture. And now these two others actually fit pretty well based on what the stars would have looked like at the time based on this pillar. And that's as far as I'm going to go into this, because there's so much more into it, but right here, that's all I want to point out. They're pointing to a date in time where they're saying that a comet or fragments of a comet or something is happening that looks like it's coming from a certain point in the sky towards Earth.
Calculations of the astronomers are that we're in a danger window right now where the thicker part of the Taurids could be impacting Earth.
That's what a lot of people are saying, that we could be in danger of passing through the debris stream of the Taurid meteor stream, the debris field of the Taurid meteor stream. So the Earth wanders through it twice a year, okay? And there are thicker parts that we go through here and there. That's what happens when you see a meteor shower in the sky, but most of them burn up and they don't hit the deck. They don't hit the ground, but we do have ones that have hit the ground before. We saw in Chelyabinsk in Russia, there was a massive airburst and a few people were injured by that because it's pretty powerful.
Maybe there was some sort of event. I mean, I'm open to that.
I'm glad to hear you're open to that because I've shown enough evidence to you that shows, yep, that's exactly what happened. All right, so that was a giant breakdown of everything that I think was relevant to go over first in this podcast, because there were things that were said that were just plainly untrue. And I hope I've brought enough evidence to show you guys that, hey, the mainstream narrative, as we were told, is incorrect based on the math, the numbers, their own evidence that they gave us to work with. It doesn't fit the timeline that we've been told. And there are people that are sitting in front of us that are saying things that they know nothing about. They haven't done their research. And you got people sitting here quoting things that are just untrue, saying things that are just untrue and easily provable with evidence. And I hope you can see right here in this video that there's enough evidence to bring down this mainstream narrative about the Younger Dryas, the pyramids, the Sphinx, and Baalbek.